Today is November the 25th, 2019. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University, and today I'm in Guthrie, Oklahoma to interview Kevin Norton, who's the Associate Chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And along with me is Larry Caldwell and Ben Pollard, who are part of the conservation efforts. We'll won't say any more than that, okay? And this is a collaborative effort between the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at OSU. So thank you for meeting with us today.
Thank you.
Let's begin with learning a little bit about you. When and where were you born?
So I was born in Anadarko, Oklahoma in 1959. Was raised there. My parents actually grew up and met in Seaman, Oklahoma, just right down the road. My father, or my grandfather on my mom's side, was a grocery store, owned a grocery store in Cement, and had a farm just outside of town. He was able to, through his work, have his two oldest sons also got farms for them and got them started. They've all since left, and there was nothing other than the land, and the family was renting it as I was growing up. And my grandfather on my dad's side was a sharecropper and worked in the oil field and later transitioned to full-time in the oil field. My life around agriculture was the Future Farmers of America in Anadarko. And my older brother, 12 years older than me, Lee Norton, he married into a farming family, and he had a farming operation that I joined as a laborer and worked with him from junior high all the way through high school. And that's where I really got connected to agriculture and farming, was through the Future Farmers of America and my brother and his operation just outside of Hinton. Peanuts, cotton, wheat, milo, watermelons, irrigated crops, and then a livestock operation. It's a very diversified operation, one to grow up on. Along with that, I started a big operation as the FFA project and grew it into a nice little operation that raised show pigs and then sold feeder pigs and made me quite a little bit of money while I was in high school. Bought a pickup and paid my first year in college when I liquidated it, so it was a good deal.
Good deal. And what was your mother doing during all this time?
So Mom, she had a variety of jobs. I'm the first one in my family, and actually the only one of my brothers that ever went to college. So we grew up mostly in a setting of labor type work. My mom worked babysitting at a grocery store, was a cook at the local school, elementary school. When I went to college, she quit that job and took a job as a custodian at Western Farmers Electric Cooperative. Paid very well, and she did that to help me get through school. So I was very fortunate that whenever I graduated, I did not have any debt because of my mom and what she did to help me get through school. And also, I think we'll get to this when you was talking about Oklahoma State University. I never had anything in front of me other than going to the farm and working with my brother. My ag teachers sat me down and said, we'd like for you to do this. And it was an application for a scholarship. And I didn't even really know what I was doing. I was pretty naive about anything outside of my little world of Anadarko on the farm. And they took that scholarship application and they went to Oklahoma State University. I found this out several years later and sat down with the folks in the agronomy department and told them, if you'll give this young man a scholarship, he won't let you down. Mm-hmm. And so I would have not gone to school without that scholarship. My family did not have the resources. And then my mom took the job and filled in the gap and gave me an education that I never even dreamed I would have, and an opportunity that, it's very special to me.
Do you want to name those ag teachers?
Yes, John Dawes and Wayne Wilhelm were my two ag teachers. Yeah.
So when you arrived at OSU, where did you live?
So I started in Stout Hall. It was, at that time, one of the older dormitories. It was not air conditioning. The heating was not very good. It was radiator heat. It was, but it was very economically priced. So that's where I started. And so I was in Stout Hall my first year. Then a friend of mine from high school, Billy Miller, Anadarko, he reached out to me. We got a dormitory in Kerr Hall the second year, our sophomore year. Then we moved out to an apartment in the third year, my junior year. And then some guys in the agronomy club and the range club, we got together, and there were 4 of us got packed into a little 2-room apartment. And that made it very economical, but we were on top of each other most of the time. But so I spent my last, and it was you probably don't remember it, but there was an old IGA on the north side of town, and our apartment was just right south of the old IGA. It's now, I think, a library annex.
Okay, within walking distance of
Yes.
campus pretty well.
Rode my bicycle all the time on the campus.
And your major was agronomy?
Agronomy, range management
Right.
option.
Okay.
Yes, and that all connected back to John Dawes. I was whenever I was a show, we had show pigs, and I had that part for my production ag. But then they also encouraged us to do other things. So I was on the land, range, and pasture judging team, the parliamentary procedure team, those kinds of things. And I really did like plant identification and the things relative to range management. When I got to Oklahoma State, enrolled in general agronomy, and within the first semester had figured out there was a range management program, and I switched majors, and by the second semester was on my way to a degree in range management.
Have a favorite professor?
Well, there were only really 2, Jeff Powell and Frank Thetford, and they both really invested in us. We were a small group going through. They were really good. They were very helpful, and they really just took care of us getting through school. It was a very tight program. You didn't have very many electives. You had to graduate with at least 18 hours in range and range-related classes to be able to have an opportunity to compete in the federal workforce as a range conservationist. So they kept us on a pretty tight schedule. They were pretty tough classes. I will say, outside of range, there were a lot of great professors, but Ron Terrell in the botany department was just absolutely outstanding. We had him I had him for agrostology and another plant-related class, and the both of those, he would just start writing on the board, and it's just like it just kept flowing. And he'd slide the board over, and he'd keep writing, and you couldn't take notes fast enough. He knew the subject material. He could close his eyes and describe the entire flower of a plant just from his memory. And so he was a very phenomenal teacher. He was good, and I enjoyed his classes.
So you would have graduated in 1981.
81.
And then high school would have been
77.
77.
Mm-hmm.
And you had more than one brother?
Yes, I have a younger brother, Dwayne. He followed along with me in FFA, and then he went on to went out to Burns Flat to meet cutting school. I don't remember the actual name of it, but anyway, he learned how to cut meat and became a market manager with United Supermarkets until they started the Walmart influence, and those things started impacting their business line and things like that. And he pulled out of that, and he sells Farmers Insurance, as does my older brother now. They're both insurance agents with Farmers Insurance Group.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So while you were in FFA, did you go to Kansas City? Is that where
we never went to the national conventions. Our ag teachers never took a group to the national conventions. They spent a lot of in the Mothers Club, which was really phenomenal. They ran the concessions at the fairs. They would help with the fundraising events. We sold blue and gold sausage, and they utilized all of that funding to take us to all the competitions, the shows, those kind of things. And they just maximized the ability for a lot of us didn't have a lot of money to go stay in hotels and do things like that. So they used all of that resources and that the Mothers Club generated to get us to the competitions, the events, pay for our hotel, our food, and things like that while we were out. So I think when it came down to it and balancing the sheet, they just said that's probably not one they could afford, and so they didn't. And I had no regrets, though. Did make the state convention a couple of times, and then my senior year, I was honored to be selected as a state farmer. So I do have a state farmer degree from the Future Farmers of America.
That probably helped with your scholarship application.
It probably did. I just think most of it was just those two guys taking care of me and going up and doing the heavy lifting. And I just really I owe those guys a lot, Mr. Dawes and Mr. Wilhelm.
Do you think they had done that with students before you?
So I don't know.
You don't know.
Never did ask, and I didn't really ever figure that out until you get out, you do your, you get your job, you go around, and as time would have it, I came back to work in the National Land, Range, and Pasture Contest, and I was able to do the plant ID. At that time, Mr. Dawes had retired and was helping coach a team from Marlow, actually. A good friend of his was the ag teacher at Marlow, and he came back. And so during the course of the contest, we're visiting, and so I started asking him questions about some of those things back in time, and that's whenever I found out what all had actually gone on. So I went through probably 10 years of my life not knowing exactly how all of that happened, but was so thankful it did. So.
That was meant to be.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're graduating from OSU. What's your plan at that point?
So my plan had, so during my time at school, I had, between my, so let me back up. I think, my freshman year, the professors had linked me with a graduate student, and so I was his graduate research assistant, which gave me some income while I was studying. And his research project, Paul Knight, he later went on to be with the BIA. He's since retired. I was attached to his master's work as an assistant. So I went to Fort Gibson Reservoir, and we did a vegetative survey of all the land owned by the Corps of Engineers associated with the Fort Gibson Reservoir. And I carried that through my sophomore year. Then the summer of my sophomore year, NRCS, the Soil Conservation Service, offered me a student trainee position in McAlester, Oklahoma. I was raised in western Oklahoma. I like to see what's out in front of me. I do not like trees, which is kind of interesting because I ended up being state conservationist in Louisiana. But, as a young person at that time, that was just really not the direction I wanted to go. So one of the students, master's degree folks there at OSU that I got to know, was actually a research assistant in Nevada for the University of Nevada, Reno. So they offered me a job, and I went out to a ranch just north of Elko, Nevada, and worked a summer on a ranch doing research work out there. So I did that summer. Then the next summer, and all of this is just threads of people helping me along the way. I've gave a talk one time. It's like, if I look back on my life, it's kind of like Forrest Gump. I think about the movie. It's just how things and events and people helped me get to where I was. So the ranch project was kind of running its course, and the next summer there was one of the guys I worked for on the ranch, Gordon Limberry, knew the person that ran the vegetation and permitting crew for Peter Kiewit Mining District in Sheridan, Wyoming. And he called me up and said, they're needing some help. You think you'd want to go to Sheridan, Wyoming? So I said, well, sure. So I got that done. By the time I got started, I ended up with two other folks from Oklahoma State that joined me whenever I was telling them I was going, and found out there was a couple other positions. So there were 3 of us guys that went to Sheridan, Wyoming, and we worked for a mining company doing their permitting work as they began to move across. It's surface mining of coal, really big, elaborate operation. But they have to stay out in front of that and get the federal permits to do the mining. So I got to do that for that summer. I quite honestly believed that that's what I would do when I graduated. It was so much fun. I worked with such great people, and it actually paid a lot better than anything associated with agriculture. Well, that was the summer of 1980. And between the summer of 1980 and graduation 1981, the coal industry collapsed. So I mean, there were no jobs, and the folks that I'd worked with were getting laid off. All the team I'd worked with, the career people with the mining company, were no longer employed either. So it was like, I come up graduation, and there was everything I'd planned on. Was not working. I did have an application in with the Soil Conservation Service, but I'd selected Nevada as the location that I wanted to go work because I did like being out west, being a range conservationist. It was a lot of fun. So none of that panned out, so I went back to my brother's farm. And so I drove tractor, did a lot of work, and kept applying for jobs. I flew around to a couple locations and interviewed, and nothing ever really worked out. And in July of 1981, I came in for lunch and my sister-in-law was just a fantastic cook. That was another reason to be there. My mother was not, but my sister-in-law was. So it was good to be there during the summer helping out. And I came back for lunch, and she said, "There's a person that's called for you." And I look over there, and it's a person named Fred Fortney. And Fred Fortney was the state resource conservationist with the Soil Conservation Service there in Stillwater. And the state office on campus of Oklahoma State University is still today where it was back then. I had known Mr. Fortney through my college years. I was a member of the Range Club, the Soil and Water Conservation Society, and the student chapter of the agronomy club, and then Alpha Zeta. So I was in those things, but he was an SCS employee that he and his wife spent a lot of time with the students in the Soil and Water Conservation Society chapter there on campus. And so he got to know me. We'd done a lot of activities, a lot of our community engagement work with the Soil and Water Conservation Society. They arranged it. They were very involved in the community in Stillwater. So all it said was, Mr. Fortney, I'd like to visit with you. So I called him up, and he said, "I'm going to be in Lawton. I'm going to come back through Anadarko. You want to meet for coffee and visit?" And certainly, so I did. Drove from Hinton back down to Anadarko, met him for coffee. And so we're having a great visit, and he says, and this was during the beginning of the Reagan administration. So the federal government was under a hiring freeze, and he said, we're not able to hire, but we've been able to get permission to hire 5 new people during this hiring freeze. And Kevin, I'd like to ask you if you'd be willing to come to work for the Soil Conservation Service. So I got pretty excited and said, "Yes, sir, I sure would." So he went back. I had to get him all my stuff for my application. We had to get it switched from Nevada to Oklahoma. He put me on, and I think actually of the 5 they hired, I'm the only one that actually persisted beyond 5 years with the agency. So it's a great opportunity. Again, it's one of those things where people have come along in my life, and they've helped me along the way. So I started with the agency, and to say I had started with the idea that I was going to be a Soil Conservation Service employee for a career, I didn't start there, but that's just the way it worked out. as I started with that career, it was started in the lot and field office. Tom Newmeyer was my district conservationist. A lot of great people. Joe Kuntz was a soil conservation technician. Wonderful technician. Patient. He just had a way of teaching you how to do conservation, and just a phenomenal guy. And I remember the first time, so they pushed me to get to full functional planning ability. And I remember the first plan they let me do solo. It was north of Fletcher, north of Sterling, between Sterling and Fletcher. And it was a 160 acre cropland field. The whole thing was crop, and there was water coming across it. You had no terraces, and the idea was we needed to terrace and put waterways on it because it did have active erosion. And so I go in and I kind of put the waterway where it made sense. And I remember Joe looking at all of that and says. So he said, we went to the field and we started staking that first terrace, and he got the map out and said, so how are we going to get the water from here into that? Because the waterway did not turn and go up the hill far enough to intercept that first terrace. So instead of just taking the map initially and say that, Kevin, that won't work. I mean, he took me to the field and we started surveying, and pretty soon we got it all figured out. It had some water that came off of another property, so you brought water off the hill, and it picked up water coming from another. So you had to adjust the size of the waterway so it could carry the flow. Just a wonderful guy, and they teach you a lot along the way. I think technicians are the bedrock of our agency because for the most part they're stable. They've been in that county, in that office. The community knows them. But we were going to stake a pond, and so this was my first time to the field. So they set up as a tripod an old dumpy level. We don't use those anymore, so we set up under a shade tree, have lunch, and he said, we're going to go stake this thing. So he sets up the tripod and says, I need to show you how to level this thing. So he spent, I bet we spent an hour there with me, because you got to be somewhat coordinated to level one of those dumpy levels. They're quite interesting, and then you have to spin them and come back around and make sure everything stays level. And so finally got it, and sometimes it'll make a noise when you're not doing it right, when you're getting it too tight, and several times I had to back up and start over. But we finally got there, and then he said, when I was ready to start breaking it down, he said, now I want to tell you about some of the contractors that you deal with. And he says, we're going to go, and it's a pond we were going to stake. And he said, this contractor, he's really prone to going up and just leaning on one of the legs of the tripod, and said, so you need to kind of watch him and keep him away from it, because when you have to reset it, you got to start all over again. And so lo and behold, the guy did it. I was watching him and everything, and he did. He grabbed hold of that tripod and just leaned on it. So, I mean, those are just things that, it's like, so I learned then to start watching and paying attention, because you had to do a do-over if you were going to do it right. So anyway, I think, when I think back on that year, it was different. I mean, it was my first full year into federal service. There's the SCS way of doing things, and sometimes that's a little bit frustrating. I remember RC&D coordinator, Resource Conservation Development Coordinator. I was at one of those points I was a little bit frustrated, and I still to this day believe Joe Kuntz called him and said, you ought to come get Kevin and talk to him. And Stan Rice came, and he drove a little Ford Pinto, and I mean, it was, I don't know why the government invested in those things, other than they were pretty cheap on fuel, because they were really dangerous too. And somebody hit you in the rear, it'd blow up on you. But anyway, he got a little Ford Pinto, and he grabbed me in the vehicle and he said, "I'm going to take you for a ride." And so we were in areas by then, and Lawton, Comanche County was on the western edge of the Duncan area. And so he just took off, and we went west into Tillman County, Kiowa County, and we circled up and around, and he was talking about the whole time we went around. He took me to farms and people he knew, and he told me the backstory on the farms, the work that they had done in the years before that when he was a conservationist. And all around that way, we spent a whole day just about how we've helped people, how we've helped farms, how we connect with families. And it was really the bigger story of who we are as a soil conservation agency, and not so much the progress reporting and cranking out numbers. It was really the value of how we engage with people and make a difference in their lives. And I will tell you that probably for that first year of my career, that one day probably made the difference between me staying with the agency, or starting to look for other jobs. Because, I mean, it really connected our work with people in a very personal level, and he knew their backstories, and just he was tremendous. And I'm sure on that one that he's done that with a number of employees over the course of his career. He's just that kind of person.
And he being Stan Rice.
Stan Rice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
a lot of hands-on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, it's just and he was that way. I mean, he was an exceptional resource conservation and development coordinator, but he also was just good with people all the way around.
And how long were you in that office?
1 year. Yeah. And they moved me to Buffalo, Oklahoma. So in our agency, if you were from the western part of the state and you got moved to Idabel, it was like they were trying to get rid of you. That was a subliminal message. If you were from the eastern side of the state and they moved you to the Panhandle, they were trying to get rid of you. So I was kind of in the central part of the state, and they sent me almost to the Panhandle. And it's like, what's the deal here? I called Mr. Fortney. He said, no, this is good. David Hungerford was the district conservationist. It was a good place for a range conservationist to go. I got out there. There's just over 3,000 people in the whole county, 1,300 people in Buffalo. I had a good friend, Joey Freeland. He said when they send you out there, single guys, they tell you there's a girl behind every tree. Then you get out there and there are no trees. So, so I thought that was pretty funny. There were trees in Buffalo, but the interesting thing is back then it was known you were going to move on a 1 or 2 year rotation until you got to be a district conservationist. So I bought a mobile home, rolled it up out there, and it's like the whole community showed up just to visit with you, welcome you. It's like, for every fear that I had about getting that far out in what really was a pretty remote part of Oklahoma, they just kind of washed it away. Mm. And they accepted you. You were part of the family, the community. They were glad to have you. And it was really a great place to work. A lot of work went on. We staked terraces. It's the first time I got involved in actually doing native grass vegetation, replanting old cropland fields to native grass. We'd stake several 100,000 feet of terraces a year, and I was there 2 years. And it was just a great experience. The pace of work at that office compared to Lawton was considerably different. It was a different kind of work, but the pace was considerably different, because when they got the weed off, and you started building terraces, and you kept building them until it was time to plant wheat again. And great people, and actually I met my wife now of 35 years. I met her while I was there.
So you found a tree.
Yeah, I did. Actually, it was a cafe. She was a student at Northwestern at Oklahoma State University at Alva, and would come back and work on the weekends to make some money. Her dad was a farmer there, and they came from a historical farming and ranching family, both sides, her mom and dad's side of the family, there in Harper County. And I'd been out turkey hunting with the technician, Delbert George, another good technician. Took me under his wing, showed me the ropes. We'd been out turkey hunting, came in to get pancakes, and she came and took my order. And from there on, it was I was in pursuit. But so it was the next spring before she would actually agree to go out on a date with me. But that was it's been all uphill and all good from then. So I guess downhill might have been a better way to say that. But it's
Buffalo, maybe.
Yeah. So it was great. We've stayed connected to the farm and the family out there too. So it's kept me kind of grounded in what's going on with ag in conservation. So, but it's been it's a great career. Yeah, I've really enjoyed my time with the agency.
So did you marry before you moved to the next spot?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. 1 month. We got married. I had applied for the job. We were engaged, and I'd applied for the area range conservationist job in Clinton, Oklahoma, and didn't know for sure that I was going to get it. And then about a month before our wedding, I got notification to go to Clinton. They had set me up for some training in Fort Worth. So we got, instead of the typical 4 weeks to report, they gave me 6 weeks to report. And so we got married, did the honeymoon. I went to training for 2 weeks and then came back, and we moved to Clinton area office as area range conservationist. I was there for from 1984 till 1987. And then I transitioned or transferred to Woodward. During the period 1986 to 1987, I worked all of the western third of Oklahoma. And the 1985 Farm Bill kicked in, and they started dividing up the position and area. And they let Roland Willis, the state conservationist at that time, called the area conservationist and said, we're going to put these positions back like they used to be, and have one in each area, and we're also going to put 2 compliance specialists. And so Kevin can pick where he wants to work, Clinton or Woodward. Really, I enjoyed working for Nick Lambeth, the area conservationist. He was just great, and it was hard to make the decision, but it was. We had a young child, and my wife really wanted to get back closer, so we were within 40 miles of her parents. And actually, I like Northwest Oklahoma. I'd grown to really love that part of the state. So we made the move back to Woodward, and so I stayed there till 1993 is when I went into the state office. It's interesting. The 85 Farm Bill, 1985 Farm Bill kicked in during that period. It really changed our agency considerably. It was the first farm bill that actually carried a conservation title with it, and it had really two major components. One was the compliance provisions, and that covered highly erodible land and wetland compliance. And then it had the Conservation Reserve Program, which would be, I guess, the federal government's third time to move into a large conservation program that took marginal cropland and changed it to grasslands. Was the key point. There was one right after the 30s. Whenever we had the Dust Bowl and all the major things there, so they went into a major, it was a huge conservation effort, but reestablishing grasslands was a component of that. And then there was a major event in the 50s that also generated a soil bank program. And then here we were in 1985 coming back with another one. They were the footprint of those things in Oklahoma was western Oklahoma. The majority of the highly erodible land in the Woodward area that I served, we had right at 40% of the highly erodible lands that had to have determinations made on them, and then had to have treatment on them that would bring the soil loss, the erosion rates down to T. And that varied out there from 5 tons down to 2 tons per acre. They were farming some Woodward Quinlan soils, and Quinlan only had a soil loss tolerance of 2 tons per acre. So it's quite a challenge. And so we had that workload, plus we had, in the end, we ended up with about 1.2 million acres of grass being planted, and just short of 900,000 of that was in the Woodward area, between 800,000 and 900,000. So a lot of ground to cover, a lot of great conservation work. It really made a difference. Whenever you had those marginal soils, and then you put this burden on top of the farmers for conservation, this highly erodible land, having that conservation reserve program as a path that they could take those more marginal farms and put them into grass, they would get a rental rate that was pretty much equivalent to the cropland rental rate being paid at the time. So it didn't, the impact economically on their operation was not as drastic as it would have been if you just said you can't farm it anymore. Go put it to grass, and you have to pay it all out of your own pocket. We paid 50% of the cost of establishing the grass, and then they got the rental payment for 10 years. So it was big. In the Panhandle, you take Texas County, over 1.2 million acres, 700 and something thousand acres of cropland, and we put in over 200,000 acres of grass out there. Cimarron County was very similar, not quite the size of the numbers, and Beaver County, well, they just kind of book in Texas County. Texas was a big one, but you got great DCs out there at the time, Danny Thomas, Jerry Allen, and Bob Griswold. I remember, so this would have been probably, so we started the first CRP sign up in 1986. We were still rolling pretty strong on enrolling acres in the early 90s, but somewhere in that 1990 time frame, we had one of those big, huge windstorms that hits out there. It's just typical to that part of the country, but the length and duration. And I remember he and I were talking on the phone, and it's like, this has really made a difference out here. Not near the amount of dust in the air and sediment or windblown material that we would typically have. He could tell the difference. They could tell the difference just in the air that those acres being put back to grass made out in the Panhandle. So it's interesting. They've got a service station out there that has a big chain and a big steel ball, and that's their wind vane in Cimarron County. So that tells you how they believe the wind, how they measure wind out there. So, but it really did change things. I think during that period of time, one of the greatest challenges we had was when it came to the highly erodible land provisions and those acres. We really didn't have the capacity to do the determinations to get all the conservation planning done. And it did have a set standard of treatment that had to be addressed. And it was generally meeting the soil loss tolerance for the soils on that particular field. The challenge was that, like, especially in the southwestern part of the state, cotton doesn't generate a lot of residue, and cotton was big in that part of Oklahoma, and they had a lot of soils similar to the Woodward Quinlan. In the north, we had the Cordell and some other series that were 3 tons, and so you're growing cotton on that. And if you tried to put a rotation in place that would get them there, they essentially couldn't grow cotton for but 1 in 5, 6, 7 years, which would really just crush them economically. Wilson Scaling was our chief then. The law itself really said you had to have a substantial reduction in soil erosion. It didn't say you had to meet T. So they created these things called alternative conservation systems. And we were able to look at those soils, those sites, and say, well, you're in a continuous cotton system. And this is your soil erosion that you have in that system. And nobody really disputed that. I mean, even the cotton farmers knew they had to eventually come in and put wheat or something back because they just could not continually crop cotton on the same field all the time. But we were able to get to rotations that would allow them to move the crop around on their operation in a 3 or 4 year rotation. They could continue to farm cotton, which was essential to their economic viability, and we could get a reduction in erosion that was sufficient to meet the requirements. So we created a path that we could do good conservation work and comply with the law and can keep the agriculture operation viable. And it was critical. A little concerned at the time. We brought on a lot of young employees. At that time, we hired so many people that some of them didn't come from an agriculture background. And so you're building a conservation plan that essentially a farmer has to do that in order to be able to receive their commodity benefits. Or even conservation benefits if we were doing cost share to help them with their conservation work. And so you have young people. It's very easy to slide into this mindset of being the decision maker on those agriculture operations. And you really don't have the background, the understanding of the agriculture operation, the economic viability, what it's necessary. So, when you start sliding into a decision making role and you start telling a farmer, this is the way you have to farm, that doesn't go over very well. And so there was a big challenge at that time to get our employees to keep them from going that way. I mean, there's a whole lot of federal agencies that serve as a decision maker, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service. I mean, they're federal lands, so they are the decision makers on that. So I think to back up a little bit, is when you're dealing with that kind of a situation, there's a tension that gets created between us and the farmer. And bringing those young people along, those new folks, and having them understand, really our model, and it has been since the foundation of our agency, is to work with the producer and give them information and hopefully guide them to a place that they make a decision that is workable for them. We had the standard, whether it was treating to the soil loss tolerance or substantial erosion reduction, but there's a whole lot of paths that can help you get there. So that was a challenge. We made it through it. There were tough times. There were a lot of times that we ended up in the field with a producer because they didn't like the conservation plan or where they'd come to. But when you drive out through that country today, I need to back up. Prior to 1996, when you drove out through that country, you saw a change. There was hardly a field that did not have a conservation footprint on it. You could see it in the resources responding, those kinds of things. So I mean, it was a hard time, but I think we moved the conservation needle substantially, and farmers adjusted to it. They're very resilient. They adapt well. Prior to 1996, the farm programs kind of pushed them in a certain direction. They had base acres. They had to farm it a certain way. They had to have depending upon the year and what the supply needs were. The government would, the Agriculture Stabilization Conservation Service, USDA, would set conserving use acres that have set aside. If they didn't want it all to be produced, it could be 15-25% that they'd have to take of their farm ground and their base and set it aside. so they were in kind of an environment they didn't have a lot of ability to flex or move. The 1996 Farm Bill brought a component called Freedom to Farm, which really allowed the producers to begin to select more, have more variety about what they planted. They weren't tied specifically to a certain amount of base had to be planted in those areas. So, for the next several years, it takes a while when you're only built around producing two crops, cotton and wheat, for instance. It takes a while to adjust to start bringing other crops into your farming operation, either through equipment or just an understanding of the production. So it took a few years, and now what you see is really a market-driven approach. We see across the country soybeans, corn, milo, canola, a whole different, there's just a whole range of things, sunflowers. There's a whole range of things that producers have grabbed hold of to create some diversity in their agriculture operation and to expand their rotations, all of those things that are helpful. The integration of cover crops back into their farming operation. When I first started with the agency, there was an old agronomy handbook on the shelf from the 1950s and early 60s. You open it up, it's all about cover crops. I mean, it's what we did back in those days. And we just kind of walked away from it because the farming programs, the agriculture policy at the time was not conducive to a farmer doing anything other than being focused on the crop that they had the allotment or the base on, and so they became very narrowly focused in driving their production systems, and it didn't leave a lot of room for conservation in some respects because they needed to produce at a certain pace to keep their payments coming. So we've seen, that change in the 96 Farm Bill to where we're at today just open a lot of opportunities for growth in conservation, diversifying agriculture operations, and I think it's been good.
Was that when no-till, or was no-till a little bit later, I guess? So
no-till really, it really kicked in the 80s, early 80s. So we were doing no-till field days and equipment field days whenever I was in Buffalo, and then started on the area staff in Clinton. That was a big driver, it wasn't generally regarded as the right thing to do. I mean, our traditional agriculture systems, it's like farmers that were doing it were called trash farmers. I mean, they go to the coffee shop and they wouldn't be treated very kindly, because of, it was all about clean till. It was kind of a European model. We had got to a place, even our research, all of our agronomic systems were really focused on isolation. Here's the plant. This is what the plant needs. I mean, we were very good at saying this variety of cotton needs this much water, this much fertilizer, this kind of thing. Same thing on wheat, same thing on peanuts, those kinds of crops. So we were really good at that. And then here comes this idea of no-till, and you infuse all of this residue, and you do a high producing, what we categorize as resource depleting crops, cotton, peanuts, potatoes, watermelons, all those kind of things. And we had resource conserving crops, milo, wheat, those kinds of things back in that day. So they'd rotate those in, and you needed a resource conserving crop to do no-till, to have the residue. And so folks were quite challenged. The equipment, when you'd have a really good residue producing crop, seeding the next crop into it was a challenge. Both from how to cut through the residue so that you could get seed to soil placement well, to also the weight, to not just cutting the residue, but having enough weight on your equipment to push the planter components down into the ground. it was quite a challenge, and some of that stuff was monstrous. You'd have a really big piece of equipment that did not span more than 16 feet. Well, in western Oklahoma, that doesn't get you over a lot of ground fast, and so it had a lot of pitfalls. But we're not even the advances in tillage equipment, planting equipment, all those kind of things. It just kept moving, and now it's hard to even find a place where a moldboard plow or even a tandem disc is becoming less of a tool in an agriculture operation, and those two were probably the most residue. That and the one-way plow. Those three could take out residue faster than any three pieces of equipment you could put behind a tractor. And you hardly see those being used at all today. So it's become the norm. But it was a hard slog there from the 80s in through till really about the mid-90s. And then the technology caught up and some really good pieces of equipment that conserve residue and still allow them to get a crop on the ground.
You're always having to learn, it sounds like, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you were part of the subcommittee that helped with the farm bills, a couple of the farm bills.
Mm-hmm. I've been fortunate. I tell folks I was in the field when the '85 Farm Bill hit, and the challenge of conservation compliance and CRP. And through the course of my career, I have had an intimate experience with every farm bill that we've generated since 1985. Most recently, the 2014 Farm Bill. I was attached to the Senate Agriculture Committee. At that time, the chairwoman was Senator Debbie Stabenow from Michigan. And I worked for her. But the interesting thing about it is that, and they say this for the most part, I'll give you an example of a departure here in a minute, but for the most part, the Farm Bill is the most bipartisan piece of legislation that comes out of Congress. And it's on a 5-year cycle, but we rarely, if ever, hit the 5-year cycle. But, I got to go up there and be on her staff. But it quite honestly worked equally well with Senator Roberts and then Senator Cochran. They switched chairs on the Senate side during that Farm Bill, and then across the way, Congressman Lucas and his team and Congressman Peterson out of Minnesota. So we were really, it was really kind of a family affair. We all worked well together. Everybody knew what each one had to have out of the process, and then members on each house had to have certain things, so everybody worked together to try to have a good farm bill and do the things we needed to do, and meet what the major needs were in the Senate and the House. It started. I went in September the 2011. It was a super committee. I don't know whether you remember the Deficit Reduction Act. That set a lot of parameters around reducing the federal deficit, and they had asked all the committees to come together and to trim certain amounts out of their authorizations and funding. The Ag Committee took that to heart, so they got together in September, and we worked hard through November to produce a bipartisan piece of legislation that trimmed quite a bit of money out of the conservation title. It was a little over, I think, $12 billion over a 10-year period. On the conservation side of it, it came out of all the titles. For the most part, nutrition would have been probably the least cut of all of them. I think it had maybe a $2 billion. Conservation had between $4 and $6 billion cut. The rest of it came out of commodity title and insurance. But we worked through that as pretty much a bipartisan effort, bicameral, both sides of the House. And then the super committee, the larger committee looking at it, kind of fell apart. And so that bill never that draft legislation never made it to the floor to start to be debated. So it just kind of slid off to the side, and then the next in 2012, when the Senate convened, used that piece of legislation as the foundation and started moving a markup through committee, and got it through committee, got it across the floor, and it passed the Senate. On the House side, Congressman Lucas and Mr. Peterson got their bill out of committee, got it to the floor, but then it never got scheduled for a floor vote in 2012. So that one never went anywhere. Congress changed in the election of 2012, and in 2013, you start all over because the language from one session of Congress can't move to another because you have new committee structure and everything. So you start all over. So on the Senate side, Chairman Roberts from Kansas, or Ranking Member Roberts from Kansas, was the ranking member on the Senate. Because they switched chairmanships on a rotation, Senator Cochran from Mississippi had timed out as chair of the Appropriations Committee, and he was the longest serving member on the Senate Ag Committee, so he came back and asserted his chairmanship for the Senate Ag Committee. So really started with the same framework legislation, but Senator Cochran had different, as you would expect, a Southern senator is going to have a little bit different priorities than a Plain State senator. And so there were adjustments made, but it was still a bill that was assembled in committee that had very strong support, and it moved out of committee and went across the floor with very good record. So the Senate produced theirs. Again, Congressman Lucas got one out of committee again, got to the floor, and it failed. And it was very, very disappointing. The leadership came back together with him. They split it apart into an agriculture and a nutrition bill, two different bills. They voted both of them. They went back through two series, and both of those got voted and moved forward. And then in conference, they brought the two House bills back together with the Senate bill and conferenced a single bill, and got that one passed in February of 2014. So that farm bill went from September the 11th to February the 14th in different cycles and things like that. So great farm bill, actually. I think if you were to look at a farm bill that had that many cuts, and then you were to look out across the agricultural landscape, the way the policy got constructed in the programs, most of agriculture did not feel the impacts of those cuts in any of those titles. That it was able to be implemented in a way that those cuts were offset with priorities and things. They just kept everything moving. It's a very good bill. Not that I had anything to do with it, but I think the folks, the leadership came together and they produced the 2014 Farm Bill. Was really workable, and we really didn't, as an agency in our conservation partnership, I don't think we saw a walk backwards in any way, shape, or form. There was a neat thing with that one. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program got stood up, and the idea behind that one is there's not enough money to do all the conservation work we need all across agriculture. So let's create a program that can take the foundation that we have within these conservation efforts that have gone on since 1935, and let's see if there's a way we can leverage private sector dollars, non-governmental organization, their funding, and bring it together in a package that will extend the reach of conservation beyond just the federal investment. And I think that was helpful to a certain extent. It certainly was a rough 5 years with that program because it went from nothing and a completely new concept. Not that partnerships in conservation was never a foreign concept. Our agency started with a partnership with Soil and Water Conservation Districts 3 years after we were formed. So it's always been about a partnership, but then the shared investment of private sector dollars and those kinds of things, bringing them into that fold was a little bit unique, and it's matured. So we come to the 2018 Farm Bill, and I got called to go back up on this one to the House Agriculture Committee, which had transitioned from Congressman Lucas to Congressman Michael Conway was the chair out of Texas, West Texas, Midland, Odessa area. And I went in February, and the bill was produced by December the 20th and signed into law. They had done a lot of work before I got there, so I kind of come in the process of getting it through committee and getting it across the floor, and then the conferencing, which it worked very quickly on the House side. Uniquely, this was the one time that it really wasn't a bipartisan effort. Some of the reforms that were asked for or expected by the majority, the Republican side, around the nutrition title were just not acceptable to the minority party, the Democrats, and so they walked away from the Farm Bill. And Chairman Conway was very open. Essentially, except for the nutrition title, we froze all of the language as it was whenever they walked away. So what got presented in committee was what had been negotiated between Congressman Peterson staff and his staff. That's what got laid out in committee. The nutrition title did change. And it went across the floor the same way. It was a party line vote, but the Republican Party had on the first. They thought they had enough votes on the first time. However, there was a segment of the Republican Party that wanted to deal with the immigration issue, and so it failed on its first vote. And the speaker voted a certain way against, which allowed him, by their rules, the privilege to bring it up for a vote. So there was a very intense period of time that they worked on some middle ground and allowed a vote to be taken on some immigration language that then they were able to pass it in the House. So it was not really a bipartisan effort, but it was around some very specific things. The conservation title, the commodity, and the crop insurance was not a lot of issues around that. Those were really pretty much bipartisan. During that whole point, it's pretty easy to get, as staff people and as congressional folks, it's pretty easy to get a little bit frustrated about our processes and how they work. But Josh Maxwell, who's the staffer that I worked for Chairman Conway, during one evening as we were talking about where do we go from here, he went back through the history of the farm bills from 1996 through to current, and each one of them has a unique story, and we always end up where we need to be. But it's the path there that is different, and each one of them has taken a different path. The two I've been involved in, you can see there were very distinctly different paths. But there's back in history one of them that never got out of committee on the House side. It was actually done on the floor. It never passed out of committee. So they've all had just different things that have happened. We had one that got sent to the president for signature that was missing a whole title, and it had to come back, have the title put back in, vote again, and then go back to the president. And the president actually vetoed it. And so, I mean, they just all have their history, and but the thing is my experience up there, those folks, they really just want what's best for agriculture and conservation, and they work hard to try to get it there. There's a decreasing amount of the House and Senate that actually represents agriculture. The population has moved more urban, and the number of folks involved in agriculture or connected to agriculture is so small compared to what it was 40 years ago. And so they really are in a place that they have to work real hard to create understanding across the senators, the representatives that have no connection to agriculture anymore, and help them understand the value of it, because it is about food security. And all of our food security rides on our conservation security. If our resource base is not healthy, if we're not sustaining it, we're not going to produce. We're not going to produce enough food for us, which is our security, but it's also we feed a whole lot of other countries, and we affect their security. And so, conservation is the foundation of that. I think our country, when you look back, 1935, and where we're at today, a phenomenal story of conservation and the successes, and how, like we were talking about with conservation tillage, how agriculture has moved over that span of time, not just in the, from the horse-drawn type implements to the kind of tools that we have, but the implements, the genetics. We produce more food today on fewer acres than we did 10, 12 years ago. And that's a large part of that's because of genetics. We're better applying our nutrients by banding them. We have formulations now around fertilizers that release slowly over time. There's nitrogen stabilizers that keep us from losing the nitrogen into the atmosphere or leaching into the, all improving water quality, the overall quality of our environment, but it's also improving the bottom line for the agriculture producer. Better production with less inputs, and more. In my estimation, we're more sustainable because of those kind of things.
And soil health has become a big key to that too.
It has, and I go back to that discussion I had earlier about the 50s and 60s. I think we were very much about soil health back then. We didn't use those terms, but the cover crops, the rotations, those things, our farming policies, the 60s, 70s, and 80s took us a different direction. I think we've learned. I hope our country's learned from that. We never go back and repeat that kind of a thing in our supply control type environment. But we spent a good amount of time. I think a good friend, Mike Thralls, he and I sat and talked one time, and I said, what we've done is we've really turned our soils into kind of a petri dish. We put our seed in it, and then we give that plant everything it needs, either through irrigation, through fertilization, those kind of things. And it's really become kind of a sterile environment. And the whole soil health movement is turning that all around. And we're actually treating the soil as a healthy environment, just like you would not put a potted plant in your house, and you would not put it on top of a brick and then start throwing everything that plant needs. You want to put it in a healthy soil. And so you go buy your potting soils and those kind of things. It's the same thing for our production on our crop producing plants. Is let's have a healthy environment that seed can establish itself, it can thrive in, that you can provide it the nutrients, and we make best use of the water that falls. It doesn't run off; it soaks it up. The analogy of spilling a glass of milk on this table or this carpet. You spill the milk here, it just runs right over it, get all over you. I spill on the carpet, it's going to make a spot like that. And so soil health is all about having that healthy environment, so the rain that hits it stays where it falls. The nutrients that you put there, they're tied up, they're absorbed, they become available to the plants. through the microbial activity. And it's like with the conservation tillage, we learn. We lost a lot of acres of conservation tillage because we didn't account for the amount of nitrogen it took to feed the bugs that would break down that residue. And so you leave that residue, there's a microbial process that engages to break down that residue, and they're going to get what they need from the plants and the soil, and it becomes less available to that new plant, that new seed that you put down there. So we were seeing where you would plant that wheat crop, and again, yields are different back then. We're getting better yields because of our genetics and things, but you'd see a crop that was going to yield 40 bushels per acre might yield 30. And the difference was we didn't put the extra nitrogen in until it could come into balance. So that first year of conservation tillage, you would have to generally infuse, as a rule of thumb about it, an additional 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre, because that's what the microbes needed to start breaking down the residue. And then within 2 years, 3 years, it would come into balance, and then you could go back to your regular fertilization rates. You learn that stuff. Same thing with the cover crops and the soil health. We're taking a fairly sterile system, and we're building it back. And so with that are some biological processes that we have to compensate for until it can come back into balance.
You were doing some of these things. Let's back up. You came to the Stillwater office in 1993.
Mm-hmm.
As what was your role when you moved into that?
So I took a lot of jobs nobody else wanted in my career. Yeah. So I will tell you, when I went to Woodward, there were some folks that said, you got to be crazy. That's just like driving off into the worst workload you could possibly face, because everybody knew that's where the farm bill hit the hardest. And to me, I didn't mind working, but also it was just the opportunity to really make a difference was there. I'd worked at that. Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Pollard, spent time with them during those days, dealing with a lot of conservation issues, conservation district board issues, and things like that as we were moving, that conservation needle that direction. And it had rocked along from 86 to really about 91. And Richard Heiser became the state resource conservationist in Oklahoma. He had been the state plant materials specialist in Texas. Bud Fountain, our state conservationist at the time, knew him real well, and had brought him up to Oklahoma as state resource conservationist. And in that whole effort of all the things that we were trying to deal with, they decided that they needed to look at having a compliance specialist in the state office. And so Richard advertised it. By the time he got selected, Bobby Jack Jones had become the state conservationist. And so Richard encouraged me to apply for the job. And so it's like, I spent a little bit of time talking with my wife about it, and this was a big change because we were really in a good place in Woodward. Enjoyed the job, great relationships, not only within the conservation community relative to our work with NRCS and Water Conservation Districts, and they were phenomenal during that period of time. Stood up grass planting operations. I mean, you have so much to get done. And districts leaned into that, bought equipment, helped facilitate all of that grass planting work, terracing, all of those kind of things, to go into a position that did not exist, was all about the more difficult things that we were having to deal with at that time. Appeals, making sure that we were complying with the law. I got the job, went into that, and right off the bat, they decided that we didn't need to allow our field office people to spot check their own conservation work. And so I got selected for the job, had not yet showed up to that position, and was called in and said, okay, you've got this to do, because we're going to have to figure out another way. So we stood up compliance teams, and essentially it was area, field, state office people. We came together. It was the small group was voluntary. The field office people were voluntary. The area and state office people were voluntold. And so we had that whole effort that we stood up for a couple of years, where we were going around doing the reviews. The field office people felt like it was intrusive, that they were being I don't want to say spied on, but they were being, that the level of quality oversight was like, you don't trust us, which I don't think there was any reason for them to think that. Really the deal was trying to remove that that thread that other people could say, well, you know, they're checking their own work, or they're good friends with those farmers. This person's getting away, is just to remove any opportunity for folks to believe we weren't being fair and equitable in our treatment. So it finally worked itself out after the first year, and everything that we come up with was legitimate. We would work back with the local field office folks. Sometimes the Soil and Water Conservation District Board would be involved, and we'd find a path, to work with those producers to get them where they needed to be. But we did all of that review from there. So I did that, and along with, I took on the automation work. At that time, we were transitioning from our very early automation started in 1985 with a PC 6300 made by AT&T, 64 megabytes, not gigabytes, 64 megabytes of RAM. And I think it had 64 kilobytes of RAM, 4 megabytes of storage. So I mean, that's your phone has more capacity than those computers did at that time. And then we had a very foundational piece of software called CAMPS, Computer Assisted Management and Planning System, and we were transitioning from that to field office computing field office computing system. So I had to take that on too. So I had compliance and automation, and it was not really popular, to say the least. And so I had that responsibility through till 1996, when I became the state resource conservationist. I went in working for Mr. Heiser, and then he went on to the regional office in Fort Worth, and I was able to succeed him in that. During that period of time, the 1996 Farm Bill kicked in, and the Great Plains Conservation Program, the Agriculture Conservation Program, the foundational programs to getting our conservation work were done away with, and they stood up this new program called the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. That was our broader-based program, $196 million a year. Hang on to that, because you'll realize that wasn't enough. You're pretty quick, but the Wildlife Habitat Incentive Program came along, the Wetland Reserve Program, a whole different suite of conservation programs. Well, we had, because the Great Plains Conservation Program had gotten smaller, all these other programs, we had done away, the agency had done away with an assistant state conservationist for programs position that managed the programs, and had gotten folded into the state resource conservationist staff. So I took on the SRC job along with the conservation portfolio that we had at that time. Just a few months into that, Ron Clark was the state conservationist by then. He called me in his office and said, it just seems to me like your technical folks aren't doing technical work. The state agronomists, the state range conservationists, the state foresters, the state biologists, those are all folks that are about conservation planning and making sure our field people have the tools they need to be, when you're engaging with a farm or a rancher or a forest landowner on the ground, that they have the resources to guide an effective decision-making process. His view was they were beginning to become program managers, working on numbers, dollars, allocations, things like that. And I tried to convince him that even though that was true, we could still find a way to blend all of that together and get back to the technical part. In his wisdom, he allowed that I was incorrect, and that although he valued my opinion, he felt like we needed to do something different, and we were going to create the Assistant for Programs, the Assistant State Conservation Programs. And we were early in that. It was already it was starting to happen across the country, and so he was early in that transition of putting those positions back in the states. And so it was kind of like the discussion that Roland Willis had with Nick Lambeth about where I could go. Ron Clark had the same discussion with me, except it really wasn't an option. He said, "You're going to be the assistant for programs." So he said, "You're going to go here, and then we're going to do this other position. We'll put somebody else behind you as the state resource conservationist." So I became the assistant for programs in early '97, mid '97, and stayed in that job till 2007. And then I went to the state conservationist position. During that time, that little portfolio of $196 million in the Environmental Quality Incentive Program grew to just over $1 billion, from 196 million to just over $1 billion. 2002 Farm Bill was the first big infusion of money. Then 2008 infused some more. And today, at the end of the 2023 Farm Bill, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, if it's funded at the mandatory funding level, will be just over $2 billion of conservation funding a year. The Wetland Reserve program is now Wetland Reserve Easements Program. It's combined with the Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program, which is now called Agriculture Land Easements. It'll have $450 million a year. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program, $300 million a year. And it just goes on. But we really are now at a place that our conservation portfolio, including the Conservation Reserve Program, is around $4 billion of annual investment in cost share programs and incentives to encourage conservation across the country. So, I went from what I thought was an overwhelming workload and challenge to now we have these big, huge resources that have been entrusted with us to really make a difference across the United States. So,
and less staff to do it with, from what I understand.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. We do have, if you go back to 1996 to now, we have a lot less folks to deal with. The one thing, is farming's kind of the same way. We got fewer farmers covering all the same acres, and some of them have even grown their operation. So I think one of the things that we have to understand and embrace is that the technology has created an opportunity for change, and that's one of the things we're working on now within our overall leadership of our agency is how to, we've got all this investment in technology. Our agriculture producers are investing in technology. How do you bring that in to our environment and actually create efficiencies around it? Larry, Ben, they remember whenever you do anything with engineering wise, and it was at least two person operation. You had somebody on the level, you had somebody on the rod. You deal with land leveling, a lot of times it'd be a 3-person operation because of handling the surveying equipment, people out on the end of the rod, and then having to lay out your grids and everything else. 2-3 people plus you wore out a truck. Today, our levels are all electronic, one person show going to the field. When it comes to land leveling, we have units that are geospatially enabled. You can mount your unit on a four-wheeler, get it calibrated, and they go back and forth in the field, come back, download it into a computer, and it will process a best fit land leveling, and then you can start adjusting it. Something that would have typically taken 2 people, 3 people to do the surveying, and then another week in the office doing your plotting everything, trying to figure out your cuts and fills and balancing everything, then going back and staking it all. We can do it with one person moving all that way and give the contractor the electronic data. They can put it into their tractor and start driving in circles, and the equipment makes all the adjustments as they go. That to me is efficient. We're even in a place now that because a lot of the equipment has got GPS units in it, that we actually could very well take the after they plant their crop, they could be recording the data on their elevations. They could bring that to us, and then we could start doing their land leveling, cut sheets, and things like that without even having to go do a survey in the field. So there's just a lot of opportunity, in the area of planting, fertilization, precision ag. Now they can, we're trying to build a system where they can share that information back with us, and it's coming in just, by a specific point in their field or points across their field. We know exactly what they've done in way of planting, of applying their nutrients. So it's just exciting, and we've got to get on that. We have to look at all this automation and find ways that it's actually working for us and we're not working for it. That we're enabling some of that foundational work of conservation planning, the resource assessment that we have to have, the basic analytical analysis of that resource information, that we have that processed for us, because it all starts with a soil survey, and then it's what you're doing on top of that. The topography, those kind of things, you have that base information, and then you go to the farmer the first time with some foundational information instead of the first visit to the field is, show me your farm. So they can give us that, we can process it, we can go, and then we validate it, we reinforce their concerns, we identify places where our information doesn't align with what they believe is going on, and we start that conservation planning process just a couple of steps ahead of where we would have back in the past. That's all about efficiency of service, and we're not cheating anyone on that field-based engagement where conservation really makes a difference. You can't, we're sitting here in the Guthrie field office, and you can't sit here in this office and do a conservation plan for a field 2 miles up the road without going to that field and really validating the conservation needs of that field. You can't do it without engaging with the producer. Your values around your property, your family are different than mine. They're not wrong, they're just different, and they're framed by a lot of history. And that's the way we work with producers. It's not our values, it's about your property, your values, where do you want to go, and then how do we inform that process and help you get there, along with understanding the impacts of that on your natural resources. And we'll always want to tell you and inform you anytime that a decision is likely going to cause you to have erosion problems, impair water quality, turn a beautiful clear pond to pea soup because the nutrients cause an algae bloom in it. So I think, yes, we're down on resources, but I don't see that as anything other than an opportunity to find ways to work smarter. And I see it as no reason to retreat off of our values of assisting agriculture producers in good conservation decisions around their natural resource base.
Okay, that's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Okay, let's back up and talk a little bit more about your time in the state office here in Oklahoma. Some of the major programs and things you were accomplished during that time period.
So so I think when I go back to the '96 Farm Bill and everything that came out of that, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program in the '96 Farm Bill, it was around priority areas. So there were a few of those around the state, and then there was not much money left. Once you dealt with priority areas, there wasn't much money left for just the regular, typical conservation work in the field offices or each county office. So the 2002 Farm Bill changed that, poured more money into the program, and then actually had a prohibition on actually doing the priority areas alone. So we shifted more to a locally led conservation effort. We'd start with the soil and water conservation districts. They would set their priorities around their resource issues that they had. Those would kind of move up to the state technical committee, which was really unique. It came with the Farm Bill, but it caused us to bring together all the agriculture and environmental interests in the state of Oklahoma and lay out our conservation program and seek their advice on what our priorities should be and how we should operate. And it was really more of a consultation type thing. It wasn't a voting Robert's Rules of Order kind of thing. And it was really interesting over the period of time from '96 to 2002 how it did go from really you'd go into the room and you'd have the ag interest on this side, and you'd have right directly across from them, if you set it up in a horseshoe, would be the environmental groups, and then you'd have the folks that bridge the gap at the other end. They would just come in and seat themselves kind of that way around their alliances. And then to watch as Darrell Dominic became our state conservationist in the early 2000s, and he was really a good facilitator, and how over the course of the balance of the '96 Farm Bill and then the 2002 Farm Bill, how we came to more of a collaborative approach, and people got less defensive about their issues, and it's like, how can we work together, ag and environmental, to get to a common purpose? So we saw that happen, and I think that it became pretty much the framework for successful state technical committee engagement, and something that I even carried in my next job to Louisiana. The Wildlife Habitat Incentive Program, we pretty small program by comparison, $70 million a year nationally. Our part of that was really not that large. Operated as an independent program, had way more applications than we could ever get to. Steve Tolley was our state biologist, and I'll visit about him even yet when we talk about WRP. Just a really good technical person, really understood how you create wildlife habitat out of working agricultural lands. The opportunity for those two things to come together, because a lot of the wildlife community felt like that you needed to not have ag, not produce agriculture products, and that you dedicated the land use to wildlife. And in fact, a successful wildlife population, really, it takes good agricultural management, and you can have both. And he was running or helping me with both the Wildlife Habitat Incentive Program and the Wetland Reserve Program. In fact, he really was the key driver in that. And for us to be effective, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation had a private lands program, and so we actually built an agreement where they actually put a person in our office that was on this, that it was attached to the SRC staff, State Resource Conservation staff, that helped us in private lands wildlife habitat effort. And so we started there. Then we moved and actually created 4 positions. They paid for them. We contributed about 45-50% of those folks' salary, and they actually helped us deliver the Wildlife Habitat Incentive Program. And it worked very well, and it was a shared effort with us and the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. So I think through that program really found its niche across the landscape here in Oklahoma, and it connected with a private lands conservation effort. But it was all about, none of it was about setting anything aside. It was all about building habitat on working ranches within agriculture production areas, using buffers and harvesting and things like that to promote and increase wildlife habitat. So it was really good. The Wetland Reserve Program was, we're a little state when it comes to Wetland Reserve Program. That program was built to deal with wetlands that had been converted prior to 1985, and there was a whole history of that, especially in the Mississippi River Valley, in particular, where during the 60s and 70s, we, federal government, Soil Conservation Service, we helped drain those fields and bring them into agriculture production. So we'd push out great amounts of bottomland hardwoods, hardwood forest. We'd then go in and either through installation of drainage tile or surface drainage ditches, we would drain the area and make it productive for agriculture. So there was this whole history of converting wetlands. The first President Bush set as a goal no net loss of wetlands, and the Wetland Reserve Program became a key factor in delivering on that promise. And so we would go, it was not eligible for any lands converted after 85, but anything before 85 that a person wanted to put back into wetlands, we would actually place an easement on it. Well, its home really was the Mississippi River Valley. And that's all the way up to Minnesota. But here in Oklahoma, I mean, we in the southeastern part of the state did the same thing. And then we even had on our more western wetlands, they look different. They occur in a different place in the landscape in a lot of situations, but we've had quite a bit of wetland conversion in our state over a period of time. So Steve, again, the biologist, really had a vision for this. He really had a passion for restoring these wetlands, and so we got busy. And when I left Oklahoma, we had about 60,000 acres enrolled in the program and restored. The Red Slough project in McCurtain County was really kind of a flagship project for the whole nation. Over 7,000 acres down there that had been an old rice farm. It had levees, had irrigation infrastructure. A lot of things were in place that lended itself for doing wetland restoration. And so he and Jim Green, the DC down there, district conservationist, they got busy and started making contacts and working on that project, and we were able to begin to buy or place easements. We would pay agriculture value for the land for the surface use and rights, and we take that. The producer, the landowner, gets to continue to own the land, pay taxes on it, use it for quiet enjoyment is the legal term, but it's recreation, hunting, whatever they want to do. They maintain access control. They can't keep us from engaging on the property because we bought the surface rights, but we don't, by virtue of our easement, allow public access or take anyone onto the property for any other purpose than to work on the restoration. so they were able to begin to put that together, and along with it came the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation weighed in, and they were getting grants through the North American NACA, North American Waterfowl Conservation Act. They would bring some additional money. The Forest Service acquired some of the land from the landowner and made it a part of their forest. I forget the National Forest System. I can't remember the name of the actual forest down there. I was trying to get rid.
Washita?
I don't know whether it's a Washita or the maybe it may be. So anyway, we've got all those players coming together. And everybody interested in developing that into just this beautiful wetland complex. And that was the neat thing about it, and what made it so different from a lot of the other things we were doing in Oklahoma and what had been done around the country is we weren't, this was coming together almost on a watershed scale. And it was a large block of wetlands, all contiguous, all interconnected. Had the Red Slough as really the lifeline or the artery for the water, and the opportunity to pick it up and move it around. We spent a lot of time putting in structures that we could manage the depth and the flow of water from one unit to the next, creating everything from emergent vegetation to more stable hardwood plantings, and it had the whole range. And so within that unit, you think about, when you go into a watershed, you have the artery, then you have the adjacent floodplains, and then you have all the fingers that go up through there. Well, over the course of time, we've taken out, maybe 80-90% of the wetlands that existed in that watershed. And so here you bring this back at a very focal level of 7,000 acres, and in that we really restored all of and concentrated a lot of restoration to really offset all the other wetlands that were converted in the watershed. So we created so much value. You could take the approach, well, this is what it was, so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to put it back just exactly like that. Well, then you leave all of these other values up and down the watershed that have not been accounted for. So it really was, and again, I would say Steve Tully and Steve Barner from the NRCS side were two pivotal people in that process. Steve he was raised here in Oklahoma, had started his career, went to Kansas, and in 2000 he applied for, and I selected him as our wetland reserve coordinator, and he came to Oklahoma. We located him in McCurtain County. He loves the program, he understands it, and I think we've had a lot of value created around our wetlands because of his interest in the program and the work that Steve Tully did with him. So it's a model. You go out west, and we have an area, a wetland complex in Tillman County, very similar kind of thing that happened there. Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation is a part of their wildlife habitat management unit. It's beautiful. Again, multiple partners came together. We've got a big sheet pile weir that's a control point for the water and holding it so that we can flood the wetlands. We brought help bring a pipeline from a reservoir down to create some stability out there. There's you have wet years and you have dry years, and sometimes you have a dry year, dry part of a year when you really need the water for your waterfowl habitat things. And this just created the ability for us to make sure that there's the right amount of water present at the right amount of time. Central Oklahoma, a very similar thing in the Drummond Flats area, and then in just different pockets around the state. That program has really made a difference. It's for a state that isn't really known for big wetland complexes, that program has really done some great things here in Oklahoma, and in some respects, we've led the nation in certain uses of that program. So it was really exciting to do that.
Did it bring any particular wildlife back? Do you know?
Oh, sure did. That's a good point. And I got to tell you, these guys will kill me because I'm going to butcher some of these. So in that Red Slough project, there was a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ken Williams. He was a birder, but he was. And that's the other thing about it. It was such a team effort. I mean, we would have monthly meetings in Stillwater where we would look at where we were at, what we needed, and where we were going. And it would be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the NRCS folks, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, Alan Stacy with ODWC, fantastic, Ducks Unlimited, Eric Held, Scott Manley. It was a large group of people, and they were all working together to shape the program. But at different times, Ken and Steve Tully would send pictures of like the roseated spoonbill and different species of wood stork, things that hadn't been sighted in Oklahoma for a number of years, and then they were starting to show up in McCurtain County, and it became a hot spot for birders. In fact, because we control all of the surface use of it, we even granted some compatible use authorization for them to put a birding tower in down there. So folks, and it's a nice one. It's up high, but you can get a group of people in it, and they can actually survey the area around and see the birds. They're very unique. They're not unique as you go down into South Texas and southern parts of Louisiana, but for them to make their way up to Oklahoma was really quite phenomenal. It brought some new species, alligator, the American alligator, endangered species. It's been brought back to life and off the endangered species list because of a number of conservation efforts, but actually have alligators resident on the Red Slough now. Some people look at it, that's not a good thing, but it really is. Ecologically, it is, and they're reproducing where you actually see little alligators being reproduced there on the site. So it's really a great success story, and I think we probably have got stories like that associated with all of our wetland units from the east to the west, where things have we've seen more stability in the populations. And a lot of people, when you talk about wetland reserve program, they get focused on the ducks, the geese, the huntable type species, and that's really just a small part of what these things are about. There's a lot of shorebirds. There's a lot of species that migrate that are really not a part of the huntable population, or things that people gather recreation around in terms of hunting, shooting, food source, and that kind of thing. These wetlands provide a lot of opportunity for those folks and have helped those populations, and they're all important to us. The United States is a part of the whole North American Bird Treaty and how we exchange resources and habitat between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So there's a big treaty, and these things are just all helpful in supporting that whole migratory bird population beyond just ducks and geese and those kind of things. So.
And the monarch butterflies, of course.
Yeah. And they actually use wetlands too, along with the prairie species and putting some pollinator species back in the milkweed and those kind of things. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's see. What was the other programs that were going
a lot of your efforts have been on Farm Bill and on rangeland. And as far as working around in the field in Oklahoma, just the importance of the watershed program with respect to tying in with those other conservation programs.
So, yeah, it's interesting. So I grew up in Anadarko, Caddo County. Probably a county that the government could have bought, moved everybody out of, and saved a lot of money on. So I grew up there in Anadarko, up and down Tonkawa Creek, which is a watershed project. Little lake out south of town, Rogers Lake, was a PL 534 watershed project around the Washita River floodplain effort or flood protection effort. Sugar Creek, I as a kid, I lived on the banks of the Washita, fished it, fell in it, luckily survived it. Sugar Creek was right there, drove up through Gracemont and Binger and right on up to my brother's farm. It was a corner of Sugar Creek, came through a corner of the property. The neighbor to the north, we went and fished in those watershed structures, and I didn't even connect any of that. I guess that's a long story to tell you. I grew up around the watershed program and didn't even connect the dots on any of it. It was just a part of my life growing up. It was a part of our community. It were the things we did. It didn't have that. I didn't have that awareness of flood protection or any of those kind of things until I joined the agency, and then began to work, within the program, and started to really connect everything together. And it's just, there's just a large part of Caddo County that wouldn't be there if it hadn't been for those watershed projects. There's certainly the Washita River. The intensity and frequency of flooding from what my mom and dad shared as young people to what it was whenever I was growing up because of the expansion of the flood protection program upstream from Anadarko. I think, folks, there's a lot of value. I worked for a farmer when I was in high school, and even through college when I'd come back on breaks, I would Topper Jackson there in Anadarko, farmed the Washita River. Beautiful land, productive, but you think about how many crops he would have not got out. He lost crops because of the flood, but had those structures not been there, how many fewer crops he would have gotten. There's no doubt that the flood protection program was a huge effort, benefit to ag production out in southwestern Oklahoma. And for recreational purposes, I fished a lot of them. Spent a lot of time in a little John boat running around out there as a child growing up. I think it's really it's phenomenal. It's really a neat partnership when you go back to it. It's delivered through local sponsors, so you've got that local Soil and Water Conservation District Board that is driving the priorities around it. They're part of the effort to work with the local producers to get the structures in place. They deal with the operation and maintenance. These things have a long-term benefit, so there's things that happen over time. When I went to the Clinton area office, one of the Nick Lambeth was the area conservation. I visited with you about him earlier, and he's just a phenomenal individual. Really helped me. That office probably framed my approach to work more than any other. He very much was in charge of that office, but he got us together as a team. Baker Reed's the engineer, me the range conservationist, John Riley the agronomist, the soil scientist. His name slips me now. I can just see him right. Harold Moffett, the soil scientist, and Sandra Huff, the secretary. She was a big part of the operation of that office, and we were around the table working, solving problems, visioning. Nobody worked an 8-hour day in that office. he just inspired you to work hard and to work for the benefit of the folks there in the southwestern part of the state. But he called me in one day and he said, there's this, I think it's Rainy Mountain 31 was the site, and it's down in Wichita County. He said, we've got this watershed structure, and he flew, he had a private pilot's license, and he'd fly. He said, I've flown over that thing, and it is just an eyesore. He said, you can see yourself coming up on it for miles. And they'd cut the spillway for that structure through a really shallow soil. It was a clay textured soil. It was really very difficult, but it had the side slopes of the spillway looked like the Badlands of South Dakota. It was just that incised, and they weren't reels; they were gashes. And he said, you just need to fix it. And he said, if you could, I want you to just whatever it takes to get it fixed. Let's do it. So I got with Steve Kelly, the district conservationist in Mountain View, and we went out to the site the first time I saw it. It was horrible. The slope had cut. Actually, the sediment, the soils had all filled in the spillway. It was not even at its designed level. And it was just really, and even those soils were not very good, that when they washed down into the bottom, they did not grow vegetation very well. So the spillway was really in pretty bad shape, not just the cut slope, but the bottom of the spillway. So we got busy, and we started, the watershed crew helped us with the surveys, and what did this need to get back to for the original design, final checkout, what should have been there, as far as the base of the spillway. Then we had to deal with the side slope. Well, how do we get vegetation back on that? You couldn't work with the soils that were there. They'd already proven to be a failure. We identified a neighbor. He was willing to let us take the topsoil off of a part of the property. So we built this plan and went through, and we reshaped that spillway. Went and borrowed some topsoil from a neighbor's farm, really good soil. They applied it to that, and then we used Excelsior mat, which is the first time it had ever been used, to my knowledge, in the watershed program in western Oklahoma. It may have been used in other places. And we put down native grass, the Excelsior mat, and finished that, and it turned into just a beautiful project. But those kind of challenges were all over the place. But Don Vanderseipen was the Assistant State Conservationist for Water Resources. He and his team were very helpful. They found the money so that we could put together the plan, let the contract, complete it, and really, that was my first direct engagement as a staff person with a watershed project. And then I got to, from that point on, I would do the vegetation plans for some new construction. It was starting to slow down at that point, but I would write the vegetation plans for the new construction that was going on in that part of the state. And it's really rewarding, unique part of our work. There was I got to watch it get smaller over time, which is kind of sad. But the priorities around watersheds had kind of waned, and so we went from several construction offices. I think we had 3 planning staffs when I started with the agency: Mulgee, Stillwater, and Claremore. Chickasha, there were 4. Claremore was still in place. When I got to Clinton, the planning staff had dissolved there, but they still had a construction office at Clinton. There were still several construction offices scattered around, but the planning staffs had started to shrink a little bit. And then by the time I left, it had gotten to Chickasha and Stillwater, and then moved Chickasha to Stillwater before I left. So planning staffs got small, and the construction offices, less construction going on. So, as the program has gained a little bit of interest and momentum, of course, Congressman Lucas is a major champion around the rehabilitation effort. These things have have gone beyond their 50-year lifespan, in which all the earlier structures were constructed with an idea of a 50-year life. So Congressman Lucas has come along. He's a champion of watershed rehabilitation. Oklahoma leaned in. Of course, Larry Caldwell was a key player in that effort. Ron Clark, and then later Darrell Dominic, and we've been able to start working on those that have become high hazard. There's a greater risk of loss of life and property if there's a structural issue with the dam. So Oklahoma leads that effort. It's been I was here, got to watch that unfold, and it's pretty exciting. But there's so much work left to be done in that regard, and certainly Oklahoma has the lion's share of that workload, with over 2,000 of the structures in a program that's 10,000 structures strong, 12,000 structures strong. We've got well over 2,000 of those. So. Right here in Oklahoma. So it's really it's a great program. It served well. Critical area treatment. We had a component of it at one time that was, the thought was that, whenever you do this watershed plan, that you're dealing with the structures for the flood protection, but along with that came a treatment plan for all of the area contributing to those structures that that those acres would have a conservation plan on them. They'd be measured. They would be managed to a certain level of conservation stewardship. And then, and a large part of that did happen. I mean, when you look at the number of structures we have and how few of them have, their sediment basin is not full yet, so that tells you that the upstream treatment was well. I mean, that the agriculture community, the farmers, they took care of business. Now, there's some that filled up, but that's not by any way, shape, or form the majority. And you would expect sediment even in a well conserved agriculture production system. You're still going to have some soil loss, and you're going to have stream erosion. You're going to have road right-of-ways, bar ditches that are contributing. It's not just ag lands that contribute to sediment going into these structures. So you think that's really pretty good, but then there's this idea, or there was this issue, not really an idea, this is known, that some of these areas are in really bad shape. I mean, you've got washes, canyons, you got gully erosion happening in pastures on old abandoned crop fields that farmers had walked off and left in the 50s that have active erosion. So there was a critical area treatment component of the watershed program that we would go in on those areas where we had the really severe erosion. And we'd shape gullies, we'd put in grade stabilization structures, we would reform the land and vegetate it, and really I do a remarkable job in tying things down so that sediment was not hitting the stream system or making its way into the structure. So we wrote a lot of critical area treatment contracts back in the day, and they truly were priority conservation. You talk about, well, what's your conservation priorities? Where should you be focusing your resources? For that amount of money, it only went to the really bad stuff, and so it was priority conservation before we really talked about conservation priority areas or targeted or any of that kind of thing. We looked at where we had the worst problem, and it was all voluntary. Everything we've done, whether it was this or Great Plains Conservation Program, it's all voluntary. It's all done in partnership. We don't condemn anything. We don't force people to do something. It's here's the issue, here's some resources. First we start with that conservation plan, and then here's some financial resources if we have it that we could make available to you, and if not, and you want to do it yourself, we'll provide the technical assistance to get it done. But those critical area treatment dollars hit the spot, on some of the priority issues we had in those watersheds.
Yeah, along the way you've learned negotiating skills and leadership skills and just your time in Oklahoma has formed a pretty good foundation for the next step.
Yes. Well, I had the privilege of speaking to a group here last Friday down on Bryant Street, and the people that helped me along the way, the work that I've been entrusted, what people have asked me to do, it's just a part of it. Makes you who you are, and I think the agency, this work of conservation, the partnership, those local soil and water conservation district boards from the very beginning of my career, Lawton, Comanche County, walking in and having to present a conservation plan to them that I'd written with a producer and explain what that producer wanted and how we got to what that was in that plan. That's it's a pretty solid foundation to build on. It's really what our agency's been about from the beginning. And certainly I've been placed in some challenges. I think back on the highly erodible lands and the CRP issue, and having, the position I was in, I ended up having to go in the field office. Folks would get crossways with a producer, or we'd have a failure on a grass planting. They'd schedule me out to go over everything and to work with a producer. They weren't all enjoyable experiences for me or the producer. So it has framed a little bit about who I am and the approach. And I'm a long ways from perfect. I still make mistakes along the way. But this foundation here in Oklahoma and the people that I've been fortunate to work with, I've learned something from every single person that I've worked with in this agency. They've either taught me something that I could leverage, or I've learned something that's like, I'm not going to do that. I'll take this different approach. So everyone's been wonderful. We've had challenges along the way, but this is it's the heart of conservation. The Dust Bowl was just a few miles, west of here. And, this state was horribly impacted by those days and times, and, including a huge migration, west. And I just feel like that, the board, the conservation district boards, and those folks that I started with, that I started working with folks, those technicians and some of the DCs, they had 30 years experience. They had been here, they had not missed much of the history of this agency. And for those folks to share their experiences and time and help move forward, it was a great foundation. It's a great foundation. It's a great place. The people, this is America's heartland, and it's the heart of conservation.
And you made the decision to leave it, though.
Yeah, I did leave, and I went to Louisiana.
How did that come about?
I think, 26 years here. I'd been the assistant state conservationist for programs and working programs for over 11 years. I think most people, if it visited with you, most people 2 years before that would have said, and I would have told them, this is the last job I'll have in the agency. I'll retire from here. I enjoyed what I was doing. I enjoyed the people I worked with. Our field offices, we were getting a lot of good conservation work done, delivering programs well. I had opportunities to spend time in DC and other things, so it kept the job exciting and interesting. And I think it just there along about 2006, just the events and things that were going on, in my life, career, and within the agency, and I'd been able to work with other state conservationists and engage in things outside of Oklahoma, and folks were just encouraging me to think about, doing something a little different for the agency in a little bit different level. So I'd applied for a couple of state conservationist jobs and got very close to being selected, and then Louisiana opened. The state conservationist there, Don Gilmert, knew me well, and I knew him, and he called and said, you ought to put in for this. And I never thought I'd go anywhere. Like I told you earlier, I'm a range conservationist, and I'm not really, I don't really enjoy trees. In fact, I spent most of my time in Louisiana not knowing which way was north, south, east, and west. When you drive me into a forest and wind a few times, I get disoriented. But I never envisioned working that direction from Oklahoma as far as the state or field office level. And I went ahead and put in, and I don't regret it at all. I mean, I got down there, and great staff. I knew most of them because we were in the same region together. So I was going to a group of people that I knew and had worked with on other issues. As far as the state leadership team, it was refreshing to challenge yourself a little bit. Rice production, didn't know a thing about it, and you didn't have much time to try to figure it out either. You had to learn it quick. Sugarcane. Number 2 sugarcane producing. We're number 3 in rice, number 2 in sugarcane. The Delta area of Louisiana is huge agriculture. It's big. You think about Louisiana being forest, swamps, and that kind of stuff. They get very progressive producers. So I landed in forestry. Half the state's forest lands. A large part of it is corporate forest interests. They're owned by large corporations, but then there's also a lot of small, what we call non-industrial private forest lands. So, on the path of continual learning, I shoved myself right into a pretty steep curve that I had to climb pretty quick. But I got in there. The folks were very patient with me. The producers as well as the NRCS folks, but come to enjoy it. We grew a lot of partnerships down there. A large part of the foundation, like we talked about here in Oklahoma, is on partnerships. I carried that interest and that desire to build out broader partnerships around conservation. I carried that with me down there, and I saw the staff work alongside me and actually in some places lead, and we got expanded the partnerships, grew them. Had a really tragic event with the Deepwater Horizon where an oil platform exploded, killed a number of people, but then it just pumped millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And from our standpoint on the private lands, brought together a good partnership, and we stood up an initiative. Those wetlands, coastal wetlands, are so critical to the migratory waterfowl and bird population that if they had been oiled, we needed to find a place for those species to rest, to feed, to gain their strength, to continue their migration that was not in the oiled area of the coast. So we stood up a working lands agriculture program, rice fields, those kinds of things. We put habitat in place. Really remarkable. The producers responded, and we were able to get a whole lot of the rice country in waterfowl habitat. Mississippi State University did a study on it, and the amount of calories that were contributed to the bird population was just phenomenal, all on private working lands, rice farms. So it was exceptional. Thankfully, we didn't need it. The oil, they were able to cap the well in late July, and the oil never really saturated any more than the fringes of the coast, and so thankfully we didn't need it. And there were birds that got engaged with the oil, but not the populations that we feared had they not been able to cap the well. So those kind of things went on. It was 12 years there. It was an exciting 12 years. We had a lot of partnerships built around grazing lands, forestry, rice stewardship, water conservation, improving water quality. The dairy industry came under a lot of regulatory pressure, and we worked with them to, rehabilitate their waste storage structures, work on their conservation issues out on their grazing lands, and get them in a place that they're in a better position with the Environmental Protection Agency and the state regulatory agency. So just a number of challenges. Longleaf pine, something that never hear about in Oklahoma, is a pine species that evolved under a fire regime back before European settlement. It exists in more of a savanna rather than a plantation type pine forest like you'd see with the loblolly or the slash pine. Tremendous wildlife habitat. It's a grazing resource, and work with the Longleaf Pine Alliance, the Kisatchie National Forest, and with our local producers, and we're reestablishing longleaf pine, and we're really on the western edge of it. There's a little bit over into Texas, but some really beautiful longleaf pine landscapes, and with that you get livestock grazing and good quality deer, quail habitat, and a mix of species. Plant species that you don't see anywhere else, and then we've got endangered species or threatened species, at-risk species like the Louisiana pine snake, the red cockaded woodpecker, and some of those species that we're actually creating habitats. So hopefully we can keep them from getting on the endangered species list.
And the black bear?
We did have two species delisted while I was there. The brown pelican, which was it was more connected to the old DDT issue and the weak eggs and lack of reproduction. But the brown pelican is back. We restored one of the largest nesting areas, Raccoon Island. NRCS put. It's a forward island that was left from one of the lobes of the Mississippi River Delta when it was swung further to the west in Louisiana. But we put rock revetments and stored it and actually built the island back. It's the largest nesting area of brown pelicans in the state of Louisiana. So we contributed to restoring that population. And then the Wetland Reserve Program, the Wetland Reserve Easement Program, we had over 300,000 acres in that program in the Mississippi River Delta. Just over 700,000 Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi together. And through that effort, we had restored the habitat for the Louisiana black bear, and it was delisted as a threatened endangered species 3 years ago. Now, I think time gets away, but really success story. Almost all of that was on the strength of private lands conservation. Willing landowners enrolling their land in the program, putting back the habitat associated with the hardwood forest, and that in connection with some federal wildlife lands, some state management lands, and creating the corridors that allowed the populations to come back together and to grow has resulted in the delisting. But the linchpin of that is the private lands conservation effort.
And you would have to communicate with them?
Yes.
You would be?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Now, the whole program, the Wetland Reserve Program, the Wetland Reserve easements, we hold a sign up, and people voluntarily make applications. We placed, in Louisiana, placed priorities around applications that connected with other applications or other lands, but it's all voluntary. We pay about, I shared with you earlier about in Oklahoma. In Louisiana, we do have what we call a geographical area assessment of the ag land value, we pay about 50% of that instead of 100%. The program allows you to pay 100% of ag value for the easement. We pay about 50% because all we want to do is take the marginal land. We do not want the program to be in competition with ag producers, where somebody would take a very productive farm and put it in this program and get this big check and then plant it to trees. So we do it in a way that we want those more marginal lands that are closer to the drain systems, that typically you can get a crop in or you can get a crop out, but you can't do both 2 or 3 years in a row. And those folks willingly enroll their lands. They take the easement payment. We plant it. We do some hydrology restoration along the way. And then in that process, we create habitat that is more like the area was before it was drained and put into crop production. So it's focused. It's all voluntary. Producers willingly engage in it, and it's done well. We have farmers that will tell you that they were that putting a portion of their farm into that program, that more marginal, actually helped them sustain their farming operation because they weren't fighting a losing battle of investing in a certain part of their property that was not yielding a return or costing them money. They were able to put that into this program, restore it, get value out of it, and they a lot of them will lease it for hunting and recreation purposes, get value out of that, and then focus on their better crop ground that they have a chance of making an economic return. So there's a success story about how it fit into their overall farm business model in a way that assured them to be sustainable in their ag production. So pretty exciting though.
You went there in 2007?
Yes.
2007. So 12 years. So you just switched?
Yes.
Recently switched.
Yes. So I December the 3rd, I was asked to come in. Leonard Jordan, over 40-year career with the agency, remarkable individual, was the associate chief. He was retiring, and they asked me to come in on a detail December the 3rd. We have a brand new Chief Lord, that started on December the 6th, and they wanted someone with career experience, and they were looking for someone that was coming from outside of the Washington, D.C. area that had some experience with our agency, our programs, and certainly having just come off the Farm Bill in 2018 was helpful to that, but they wanted me to come in and work with him until he established himself and got familiar with the agency. And he's a remarkable chief for our agency. He's got a great vision. He's got a heart for conservation, comes straight off the farm in Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. And as government shut down and different things happened, the time there kind of got protracted. It was a lot longer than a 120-day detail. And it got extended to a 240, and then along the way, it's like folks were saying, you probably ought to apply for this job when it comes open because you've been here a while, you've kind of got it figured out. And so I did, and then I was selected for that position. It's the senior career position in the agency. The chief is the politically appointed, and then I'm the next one, but I'm a career employee. So I've been able to have a whole career of with an agency I really love culminate with this position in the agency, and working hard to do whatever we can, and the chief certainly wants to make sure that we're adjusting and making the right decisions. So number one, we're effective in the field working with each and every one of those agriculture producers, and that we're creating the efficiencies to push as many resources out to the states as we possibly can. So it's been exciting. It's been fast-paced. It's been enjoyable. It is challenging.
So, like in a typical day now, what would that look like if there is one?
yeah, there aren't any typical days. I guess it's that it actually is quite enjoyable for me at this point because the days come and they go pretty quick. And you seem to have a lot that you get done during those days. But I think that so the typical day, I think the most challenging part is you don't get all the things done you want to get done. I mean, you can look at you look at the week and everything that you planned out for the week, and you come up to the end of the week and very little of that has gotten done. And I get a little bit discouraged sometimes that we're not where the chief really wants us to be, or the department, or the administration. But then folks will say, just look back 6 months at where we were then and where we're at today. And if you take that longer view, which is kind of the way conservation ought to be viewed, it doesn't. One day's worth of conservation doesn't change the farm. A year changes it an increment, 2 years changes it more. Mm-hmm. So I think probably even within the work, I've got to take a longer term view of what we do. But I think we're spent this last year working on getting the regulations built for this new farm bill, all around efficiency. All around streamlining. We have such a volume of paper that we push onto our employees and our customers, streamlining that where we can, and then just refocusing. Washington tends to aggregate decisions at that level. I mean, they just want to pull stuff in and be in charge of everything. And, and that's not, the current administration doesn't think that's right. And I don't disagree. And some of it is not really the administration; it's just our own people. It's pretty easy to say, well, I enjoyed being a state conservationist. Now I'm the associate chief. I want all those decisions that I made there to come up here to the associate chief level. Well, I might be able to do that for Louisiana, but I can't do it for 50 states in one territory. I can't make decisions. It's not my role. That's why we have them out there. So taking this farm bill and pushing the regulations and the policy and all that, so that decision making moves back out to the states where it can get down to the field level, has been a big, huge goal, and we're actually getting there. And with that becomes because folks want to ensure that it's happening right, is building the accountability processes just to watch. That's a place automation helps us, is that we don't have to send people out and do audits anymore. We can watch what's going on through our automation, and we can start picking out anomalies and then go look at those. But typical day starts with a schedule that just within 2 hours is no longer your schedule. That's the way my day goes.
Starts very early and goes very late a lot of days for you.
Yes, yeah, yeah, it's the thing about our people is the lion's share want to make a difference. We're 8,600 people strong right now. We could be 10,500. I mean, that's our staff ceiling. We've got some challenges in recruiting and filling positions. But overall, our folks want to make a difference, and they'll work the hours it takes to make a difference, whether that's out here at a field office or whether it's in a state office. Larry and I haven't worked a 5-day work week in 40 hours, and I don't know when it started. I'll tell you, whenever I started working for Nick Lambeth, I haven't worked one since then. When I was working out of Woodward and had to work the whole Panhandle, clear over to Cherokee, I'd leave so I could be at the offices by 8 o'clock, no later than 8:15. And I'd spend a full day and get back home late of an evening back then. But we spent, I don't know how many Saturdays and Sundays, we'd be in the state office there in Stillwater. You go to church, take care of your family. They all go off doing what kids do, or your spouse takes a nap or whatever, has a women's group she needs to go be with, you just run to the office, say, I'm gonna knock out a few things, and then about 5:30 or 6, it's like, well, I got to get back to church. So it's like, that's the way your day goes. So it's that way in D.C. A lot of people, including me, are in at 6:30. And then we leave out when we can kind of wind things down later in the evening. But a large part of the days, there's 12+ hour days.
How long do you see yourself doing this?
Well, there may be money out there on that question. I don't know that I want to answer.
Okay.
Fair. I see. So I've been there since December the 3rd, so I'm almost a full year being in D.C., even though I've only been the actual associate chief since August. I see myself doing this through the next year and then into 2021, whether I go all the way through 2021 into 2022.
How long do they normally stay someone in that position?
It's
since it's not appointed.
It's a career job. I'm thinking back over my career, probably 4 years is about the most. That for a chief and an associate chief. This just the position comes with a lot of expectations and demands, and your physical ability to stay at that performance level, starts waning, so I'm thinking, I can do 4 years if I need to, but I'm not sure that I'll stay that long. But I've told a number of people this is the last job I'll have for the agency or in federal service. I actually have no interest in going over the department. I really just want to do this and do it well, and I want to be helpful, and I want people to help me. When I'm making, whenever some of the decisions might not be in the best interest, feel like we've got good people around me and around the chief that we can sit and talk about the right direction that we need to get on. And so it's really a team effort, and it's I think we've got a lot of good people around us to try to get things where they need to be. It's an opportune time. I think in my career, whenever folks have come in, they always bring change with them. For the chief and I, we came in and the Farm Bill happened, so the change was going to happen anyway. And the stuff we're focusing on is about implementing the Farm Bill, making our agency stronger, and we're not creating change just because there's air in the room to make change. So it's fortunate that we come in and the change, we have to do it. There's things that have to be done, and we're able to drive that change for a very defined purpose, not just an ideal. It's about what we really need to do. So I think it's a great opportunity, and there's a lot of people working. We, previous to this Farm Bill, typically when a Farm Bill had passed and they start building rules and creating a framework inside the executive branch to implement the Farm Bill, it's happened in a really small team type setting. And staff people that are in charge of programs working on things, the decision's been centralized around the chief's office. This Farm Bill, we, at the onset in January, built out a structure that includes people from the field all the way up through the national office. Over 200 people have been involved in all the different programs, not 200 per program, but we had to write regulations across EQIP, Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, Conservation Stewardship Program, Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and we had this miscellaneous group of rules or provisions that we had to deal with. So across all that, there's over 200 people that's been involved in that whole process. And we created a governing board at the national office that has all of the national office leaders around the table is that information's coming up. We're making decisions and recommendations to the chief as a group. It goes from the chief, or it goes from us to the chief. There's a matrix. It's all framed options. Those kinds of things are there in front of him. He makes decisions, goes to the department, to the undersecretary. From there, the deputy secretary has a governing board that has all the leadership of the department, and then finally to the secretary. So it's a very inclusive structure that starts with what are the options of the right way to do things, built with the field's input, and then we move it up to that level that the secretary makes the decisions, and we move the regulations forward. So it's a different process. I think our agency, I think our conservation partners, whether those are conservation districts or some of the NGOs, and our field people, I think are going to be, ultimately our customers, they're going to be better served by this kind of an effort rather than it being a Washington, D.C. centric effort around building regulations.
It sounds like they couldn't have picked anybody better for this position.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so. You've done a lot. We've covered a lot. Is there anything else we need to before we? I had a note about National Procedures Handbook. Is that what?
National Planning Procedures Handbook. That's way back in my history. Yeah, in the 90s. Yeah, I helped write it. So I've helped write a number of policy documents in the agency. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I had a couple. I think you're one of just literally a handful of people in the history of the agency that had such a strong background in terms of seeing all levels of the agency, from the field office to the state office to a state conservationist to the national level. If you take a look at that as a whole, and from all of those different perspectives, what are some things you've learned there that you would tell employees in the field office, their piece of this big puzzle? You really have a perspective that most people just don't have the opportunity to get.
Yeah. Well, so I've had several opportunities to speak to different employee groups and outside organizations, and I think number one is that this agency is only successful because of what we get done in the field. There's nothing, well, even in the watershed program, while that runs a lot at a level above the field, whether it's a planning staff or construction, engineering, design, all that, it still is field work that has to happen. Watershed program without implementation is of no value. So soil survey, you can do whatever you want, but if you haven't mapped the soils in the field, you haven't got anything. Snow survey, the same thing. If you're not actually measuring the snowfall in the mountains, we're not able to run our models and produce any kind of a reasonable estimate. So when it comes to conservation work, it really all is about the field office and the soil conservation technician, the district conservationist, the range conservationist, soil conservationist, the planner, and how they engage and what tools they have available to them. So they're the most important part of our agency. I had when I got this job, I was, you don't think about everybody that is still paying attention to what's going on in your life, but I had several soil conservation technicians send me emails congratulating me on the job, and one of them was a soil conservation technician. He said he had a very nice note, and then the final end was congratulations and don't forget the little people. And I was talking to a group, and I said, quite honestly, they aren't. They're really the bigger person in the agency. They're the bigger position in the agency because there's no other position in this agency that day in and day out, their sole purpose is to engage with a producer on the ground. And so it's a larger part of what we do. So, I never applied to get another job to get out of the one I was in. I really enjoyed them. And probably if I look back, the most difficult part was every time I moved, I got further from that engagement that the soil conservationists, the district conservationists, those folks have day in and day out with the producer. And it's, there's a lot, when you go back and you do that, there's a lot of excitement about seeing something happen on a person's farm and actually making a difference for them. And that engagement with them, the social part of being in the community, and you meet them you cross paths at a ball game, and you talk about, well, I need this. This is what hey, that thing we did, it didn't work out quite right. Can you come back out and look? Those kinds of things, you get away from it, and that's really, you miss it. I miss it, but but I still hang on to it. You kind of store things up and hang on to them over time. And there's all those kinds of events and things in your life that you pull back on and say, okay, what's the right way to do this? How do we ensure that our employee can work with this person and be helpful to them? So, and it's not really happening in writing the administration of a contract. It's in the conservation plan that contract was built again, and then can that person implement it? Does it really has the opportunity to produce the benefit that they really want in their farm plan and those kind of things? So it's, every step along the way helps. If we keep our focus on, if you're an area specialist, your important customer is that field office and making sure what they have. If you're a state office person, it says the area folks and the field office folks. You got to be helping downstream. It's not about them bringing things up to you. It's about you doing your job, that it moves down to them in a way that they're successful. And just this past week, the chief and I talked to all the employees in the national office, and it's the same message. The most important part of this pyramid is not the top where we reside. It's how we manage that, and we work it down so that the base of the pyramid is getting what they need so that they can touch the lives. Because number of producers I'm going to touch in a year with my job, probably less than a handful. But when you move that down to a field office, the number of producers that a technician's going to touch, dozens. The number of producers a DC is going to touch, dozens. Soil conservationists, that's where you got to make sure they're capable of doing the best job they can, because that's where the land is going to change, and that's where you make a difference in people's lives. So that's my message, is we're all important. We really work for the taxpayers of America in service to the natural resources and the agriculture producers, whether they're a farmer, a forester, or a grazing, a livestock operator. That's who we serve with this great toolkit that Congress has given us funding for. So I think my message is, and really the thing is do the best you can to be technically proficient and provide the highest level of customer service that you can. And that's not necessarily given the farmer exactly what they want, but it's giving them the best information so that they can do something. 1996, we got the EQIP program. We were transitioning off the Agriculture Conservation Program, ACEP, or ACP. And NRCS had the Great Plains Conservation Program, so we were a whole farm plan. The Great Plains Conservation Program was like the premier conservation program, because you dealt with the whole operating unit, and you built a conservation plan around treating all their resources and facilitating that. ACP was about a certain small, very narrow set of practices. They'd ask for that practice, you'd go out, yes, it'll fit there on the land. Then you set the priorities. It was approved, and then you go stake it and do it. Well, a big part of Oklahoma in everywhere but the west where they were doing terraces and waterways with it, most of it was around building ponds. And so the EQIP program came along, and everybody was like, well, we're trying to do more of the Great Plains kind of thing with that, and be a little bit broader than just a one practice here, one practice there thing. And I remember a number of producers or a number of employees saying, well, our producers just don't want that. All they want's a pond, and that's all they wanted us to do was deliver that program to be a pond building program. Well, thankfully, we didn't do that. And now we're dealing with a program that's got the potential of being a $2 billion program because it's dealing with the broader resource issues, and we carry it to the producer in a way that it's not just about getting a pond. It's about, what do you really need? Do you need water? Is it a grazing issue? Do you have a nutrient imbalance with your pasture grasses? A whole host of things, and you go about trying to help them instead of just giving them what they want. So the model is really about conservation assistance, using, as Hugh Hammond Bennett used their land as a classroom. And that's what he expects us to do, and that's what we should do, is given the opportunity to get on a farm, is use that as a classroom and work through the natural resource issues, that respect and value their goals, their objectives, their wishes, what they want in the near term, what they want in the long term, and help shape a conservation plan that is owned by them, but helps move the needle on conservation. So,
along that same line, and maybe more on a almost personal level, but if you could go back and talk to the Kevin Norton that was working, say, the day before you went out with Stan Rice, what would you tell him at that point in time in your career, looking ahead?
That was 37 and a half years ago, Larry.
But your vast knowledge of what and experiences what you've
and I am definitely not the Kevin Norton back then. It's been a whole lot of things that have shaped me during that period of time. I think you've not arrived, and you never will. I think that's probably. I think once I come straight out of college. I come off the farm. They moved me in a county south of where I was raised, so I knew farming. When I got up into the northeastern part of Comanche County, most of those folks knew my parents. It's because of the area that they were raised in, and so I could have and probably did think I knew about what I needed to do to be successful. And I think from that, as I've gone through my career, this idea of continual improvement, recognizing that times are changing, that you've got to change with it. It's not only the technology, but it's even the science. Some of the things that we were taught in college aren't the way that we were taught in college. I was taught that that a plant stored up what it needed to start out and go through the next year in its root system. And reality is that it's mostly in the basal part of the plant. You sure don't want to destroy. You don't want to take so much foliage off the top of a grass plant that it doesn't have a root system, because it needs that for moisture, nutrients, and all that. But the growth initiation all happens in the crown and the reproductive parts at the top. So the take half, leave half is still right, but for a different reason than what we were taught in college. Larry, you know this as well as anybody. What were we taught about phosphorus? It's not mobile. Mm-hmm. What did we find out? It's not only is it mobile, it can cause a whole lot of problems whenever it starts moving. You can saturate a soil profile to the point that the phosphorus becomes soluble, and you end up with Lake Uchee and Spavinaw Creek and all the issues around water quality and the poultry industry and those kind of things. So, things change. Science, you learn more. You understand those kind of things. And the minute you think you've got it all figured out is when, as a friend of mine told me one time, is up jumps a frog. And then you realize you don't really know what you need to know. So I think I'd go back as, continual learning. You need to embrace it. You need to understand that you can always learn something. You need to be learning. It shouldn't be always. You need to be learning. You need to be pursuing it. There's going to be change. Don't push back against it. 1985, I talked to you. I visited earlier about the AT&T 6300 showing up in our office. I literally thought I was going to lose my job. I couldn't type. I'd never been around a computer. All I'd done was the key punch stuff in college. This whole idea of personal computers scared me to no end. Thankfully, they gave us tutorials for Microsoft Word and Lotus 123. One such thing as Excel. It was Lotus 123 was the spreadsheet stuff. And I went up every Saturday and Sunday for I don't know how many weeks in a row until I went through all those tutorials until I could figure out what that computer was going to do. And now I can't imagine my job without it. But it scared me. I thought, I don't have anywhere to go because I can't. If that's what we're going to do, I don't know anything about it. I'm going to lose my job. So, overcome it and actually became the person responsible for the automation, the conservation planning automation in Oklahoma for a period of time. But those things can scare you. And for Oklahoma NRCS, it did. I mean, we spent a lot of time with some of our older district conservationists and employees pushing back. We had leadership across the country. I can tell you, state conservationists, you would stand in a meeting and they would bemoan the fact that we were buying computers and we were wasting all this money on it, and they could do everything that they needed to do with a big chief tablet and a number 2 pencil. Multiple times I heard that. And, because of that wasted time and energy, instead of understanding that it's moving, they put us behind. I mean, we were literally, but that mindset has put us behind agriculture. I mean, modern agriculture, it's not that everybody's going to do it, because there are small farms out there that are not going to embrace GPS systems and big tractors and things like that. But there's a whole lot of agriculture that needs conservation assistance that is underneath the operator that is in that world of automation. And we have to be thinking because the way they think. Doesn't mean we can always work with the people over here, but whenever the leading edge gets so far ahead of you that they say, well, we don't really need y'all anymore, then we're hurting because they've got a lot of ground underneath their stewardship, and we need to be able to work with them. So you gotta stay current. You gotta think forward. You're an advocate of dam watch. That wasn't even possible 15 years ago. The concept, I mean, it was a dream, and even if you could do it, the expense was cost prohibitive. And now it's a very functional, real-time tool at a value that makes it worth the investment. So those things are out there, but if you got to come from a flat-footed start, you're going to spend a lot of money trying to catch up. So
times have changed. Are changing.
Yeah, they are. The times they are changing.
You've talked.
Bob Dylan had it right.
You've talked about a lot of different projects you were working on, but when you step back and think of all of those jobs that you've worked on and projects you've worked on and people you've worked on with, what are one or two projects that are really highlight that you think are really one of the accomplishments you're really proud of in terms of the projects out there in the field? I know you've got a lot of them there, but
I don't, that's a hard one, because you think about every job you've ever done. There's always something that's a big part of that. That they all have their rewards. Nothing ever really. Nothing. See, wherever you're sitting, my sphere of influence and what could happen changes with each different position in the agency. So to sit here and to say, well, the delisting of the Louisiana black bear was the biggest thing. Well, no, I can take you to a ranch in just north of Leedy and think about when I was an area range conservationist and what difference that made during that period of time, and with that group of people in that area. That was pretty special. Just 2 or 3 ranchers, and the things that we did, the things that grew out of that, their motivation for taking their ranch and doing rotational grazing, or a passion for reducing cedar, managing their cedar infestation, beating back the cedar. So that was really pretty special. It's just, they're all, scale gets different, but at every place there's always something, that's pretty, that you make, during that time and that stage in your career, it's like, it's pretty rewarding to be a part of that. So I don't want something that I did as a state conservationist to diminish the work and the people. And that's the other part, is I don't think there's a single thing I've done in my career that was just me. I think everything. There was either a soil conservation technician, or a district conservationist, or a soil scientist. That's kind of the way Hugh Hammond Bennett set it up, is that we were an interdisciplinary team. Not that everybody was out there on that ranch or on that farm at the exact same time, but all of those things, all those people were available and a part of how you moved that thing forward, whether you had them in the back of your head while you were working with that person, or whether you picked up the phone and called them and said, I've got this issue, how can you help me? So I don't, that's a hard question, Larry. I don't think
that's fair.
I don't think I can come up with any one thing. And
this might not be any easier. Be the last one I've got, but you talk about all the changes that you've seen through your career. If you could close your eyes and wiggle your nose and look ahead, what do you see the future of NRCS in 2030, say a decade from now?
8 years ago, I didn't see an iPhone. I mean, that's the thing, is that what technology is doing. I mean, we got an agreement now that we're testing some satellite imagery that will actually, we can go over an area where your dam watch is showing that we can queue up satellites, and they can actually give us a real-time cycle of what's going on, so that if we start having a dam failure or erosion, or we want to make an assessment in that watershed, they can go to our wetland reserve program easements, and they can tell us if we got an encroachment, if there's something, if we're getting different responses from the vegetation. So, I mean, that's kind of leading edge today, that I think 8 years from now it'd be commonplace. So, there's so many different things going on around with the machine learning. Taking soils data, crop data, all this information that our university system is building around research, ARS, and all that, and that you can actually bring them together and it'll model issues, responses, things like that, where you can say, well, 20% of the land in this watershed is creating 80% of our problems. We'll be able to know where we need to go to deal with the water quality issue, the sedimentation issue, those kinds of things. I think if we don't understand that, and if we don't pay attention to it, and we don't take what's happening in technology and bring it into our field office technical guide, we have a really great structure for doing our conservation work. Our conservation practice standards, they are the gold standard of implementing things, but they're only good as long as we keep them current. So if we're not, so we've got to, I think where we need to be, I don't know where we'll be 10, 15, 20 years from now, but if we don't today embrace the idea that that's moving and that we're working to keep all those systems current, and that we're not shaping those systems so that they're feeding into this new world of modeling, of analytics-based decision-making and things, not that you're ever going to replace a farmer having the right to do this on their farm with this, but you're going to have these tools that are become more readily available to them via the internet or some supplier software, things like that. We've got to be moving at a pace so that we're relevant, because we own the conservation space. I mean, everybody else that's in conservation are in it a segment of conservation, whether it's water quality or a specific type of habitat for a specific species, or it's even in terms of the cover crop, they're in it for certain parts of the cover crop type thing. When it comes to someone across the country has information across all conservation issues and across all of the ability to engage with producers across all their different values and objectives and what they want, we really own that space. And do we yield it, or do we work hard to make sure we're important in that space? Soil health, for example, it's not foreign to us, and we shouldn't be stepping back saying, well, other people have got it, we don't need to be concerned about it. It's very fundamental to building to the conservation foundation. You build everything else on. So we need to be pushing hard and growing with everybody and make sure. One thing about it is we're so structured that the winds of change don't blow us very far one way or the other. So, I mean, we are kind of the stable voice in the room, but the stable voice has to be the stable voice of now, not the stable voice of 20 years ago. Because that one's not any good. We're beyond that. Most agriculture is beyond that. So, taking all that we know, all the science, all the history, all of the practical experience, what's out there, how do we view this piece of technology? How do we view this piece of science, and how do we integrate it so that there's a confidence that it will yield a result? And if we can't get there, then we don't make a decision until we can, but we don't just say no. We're not going to look at it. So I think that's probably not an answer to your question, but it's kind of like I can't even. There's so much today. About agriculture and about where it's going that I'd never dreamed about.
Driverless tractors.
Yeah, driverless tractors, baling cotton. Baling cotton. I mean, you're sitting there, here's this piece of equipment, and it looks like a big round hay baler spitting round bales of cotton out the back end. Who would ever thought that? And it makes so much sense. So much easier to handle cotton that way than it was stomping. I grew up stomping wagons. We'd dump it over and have to get off the stripper and go climb up in the thing and stomp it and pack it down and then go get back on the stripper again. Or you'd hire somebody to do nothing but sit there and stomp wagons all day. And then you go to the loaf type modules, and now here we are, they baling it, and it's coming right out. Who would ever thought that?
But there's going to be a role for NRCS 10 years from now.
Yeah, there's I mean, it's ours. It's ours to lead. I think, if and I think we are. I mean, I'm not saying that as we're failing in any way, shape, or form. I think it's a red flag for complacency. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't get complacent and comfortable with where we're at. We ought to be always aggressively looking at where is the next place to go, because complacency is going to kill us. And I think, you look at what the 9, 10, maybe 11 billion people by 2050. The pressure on the world's natural resources is not going to get any less. Mm-hmm. The expectations of production and food supply is going to double. We will have to produce more between now and 2050. What is that? That's 30 years. Between now and 2050, than we have produced since the beginning of civilization to feed that world population in that span of time, 30 years. So all of that runs on natural resources. And yeah, there's vertical gardening and all these other kind of things. Those things are going to happen, but they're not going to feed those kinds of things individually, or even in aggregate, cannot produce enough food to feed 10, 11 billion people.
And that's one of the lives of our kids.
Yeah, it's that generation. Yeah, it's the generation. My grandkids being born today or now, they're going to be, the youngest will be 4 in January, so he'll be 34 in 2050, and then the oldest will be 44. So and they'll be having children in that day.
They need to follow in your footsteps.
Unfortunately, I have no children interested in natural resources or agriculture. They've all gone different paths to their grandfather's dismay.
Surely they appreciate what you do.
I think so.
Understand it.
I think so.
Is that it for you?
Mm-hmm.
Then my last question may not be any easier either than it may be too. When history is written, how do you want it to remember Kevin Norton?
Oh, well, I think, that's a pretty difficult question. I've got a lot that I wish I could do over again. I think there's some people I wish I'd spent a little bit more time with that I was a little short with, around our work and expectations. I think though, in aggregate, I really would like for people to think I didn't, I was very fortunate to have the opportunities I had in front of me, that I spent the time to try to make things better for our people, or our natural resources. You want to think that when you left, things that were going well, that people behind you kept on going, that they learned, they watched, and the things that weren't going well, that you created an environment that they could make the adjustments and move on to success, and that they just didn't throw up their hands and walk away from something that, and then it's really never been about me. Wasn't the values I grew up with. It should be investing in people and things larger than yourself. And I think my ag teachers, I feel like that's why they helped me get started. And I think that's why, from them to Fred Fortney to Nick Lambeth to all the other people along the way, I think that's why they invested in me, was not to help me get a promotion or to get more money. It was to help move me to a place that I could make a difference. And so I hope that in the end, that for that little bit of time that it's really not so much about me, but it's about the things that got moving along that journey. So I don't know. And to Ben Pollard, that people remember me as a cedar hater. And that's a strong word, but with that species in particular, it's an applicable word.
And that you really did see a moose in the Panhandle.
I did see a moose in the Panhandle, and I'm thankful that some people doubted me so much that they tried to prove me wrong and found out that it actually did happen.
And did you ever get your picture with a Louisiana black bear?
Yes.
I was supposed to ask that. So.
Yes. In fact, I think if you either on my LinkedIn page, I have one of my photos is me holding a little Louisiana black bear. I got a blue NRCS raincoat on, and I'm holding a little Louisiana black bear in the picture. So yeah, I gotta get a photo with one of them. Little sucker bit me too, but that's okay. That's okay.
Well, thank you for spending the day with us.